The hour at 4 is actually past us. So with that, I'd like to call the meeting to order.
Directors Huang? Here. Akbari?
Here.
Sethy?
Here.
And Gunther.
Here.
I'm sorry, Director Weed.
Hearing all that, I will lead the suit this evening. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Public comments? No public comments. Moving on. Consent calendar. Yeah, consent. Yes, we do have a consent. We have an authorization for directors to attend the 2019 Smart Water Summit in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Just so the board is aware, Director Weed requested this to be placed on the agenda.
That is correct. Director comments? Questions? Motion to approve the consent calendar?
I'll make the motion.
We have a motion and a second. Second call roll.
Directors Huang? Aye. Akbari?
Aye.
Sethy?
Aye.
And Gunther.
Aye. Moving on. Workshop.
Yes, thank you, President Gunther. This is the first in a series of board workshops planned for the next at least a calendar year and a half that will focus on a number of water resources planning-related topics, including forecast customer water demands, water use efficiency and conservation, long-term management of the district's imported and local water supply portfolio, future water supply opportunities, the current and future regulatory framework, and updates to the district's urban water management and integrated resources planning policies, criteria, and strategies. So you can see that we have a pretty interesting agenda for the next couple of years. This first workshop will include the following topics: review of the district's integrated resources plan and guiding policies, criteria, and plan elements, review and discussion of the district's level of service criteria for water shortages, and review and discussion of the district's water efficiency master planning effort. And I should also point out that Director Weed expresses his disappointment that he was not able to attend this workshop this evening. However, he did submit a memorandum to the board, which you all have received, outlining his thoughts on water supply related issues, and he hopes that at some point that the directors have an opportunity to review this and consider his thoughts as we go through some of the topics this evening. So with that, our Manager of Water Resources, Laura Heides, will get us off and running today. We have a lot of material to cover. My understanding is we also have some board participation exercises for this evening as well, and we can take breaks at any time. Just let us know if we need to take a break. So, Laura.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shaver. Great to see everyone here tonight, board members, staff, Hussein, and others. Members of the public, I don't see any here tonight, but we're excited to share some new information and discussion on our water resources planning for the next couple of years. So tonight's agenda, we'll just go through very quickly. We're going to talk about the introduction and purpose, upcoming changes affecting supply and demand. Then we're going to be reviewing our guiding principles, the District Integrated Resources Plan that many of you are familiar with. And then we're going to receive board input on a few key integrated resources planning topics. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the level of service criterion that we use, and also our water conservation strategy and our upcoming water efficiency master plan. And then we're going to wrap up with just some conclusions and next steps. So with that, we will just turn it over here to the introduction and purpose. So you're all familiar with the strategic planning process that we've completed. just a year or two ago, and strategic goal number 2 related to our water supply. And so we are here tonight to continue our efforts toward objective 2.4, plan for future water supplies. So we've got a lot of planning to do, and you probably remember the workshops that we held and the water supply roadmap that was developed. And you can see here the fog still remains surrounding the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan and the water fix, which is no longer the water fix. But we are scheduled to update our water supply master plan or our integrated resources plan not until 2023 to begin that process. But in the meantime, we are here to do some interim planning to think about how best to respond to some of the water supply decisions that we're going to be facing in the next few years. Prior to 2025, we'll probably face some specific, have to right over there, sorry. We'll probably face some decisions related to projects with fixed timelines, like Los Vaqueros Reservoir expansion options, levels of participation in a potential Delta conveyance project, and then long-term thinking about things like water reuse and other positions on water projects being done by FOSCA and others. So here we are still on our road with the fog, and we're going to talk about a few different things that will help us navigate that fog a little better. So you're familiar, we're going to learn a little bit more tonight about the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan and some of the challenges that presents. Some of the other things we're considering in our schedule of decision-making and planning is the Delta conveyance potential projects, the State Water Project contract amendments, future efficiency targets that you're going to hear more about related to making conservation a way of life in California, and the 2020 Urban Water Management Plan update that we'll be doing, kicking off soon. Some of the building blocks for the discussion we'll be having tonight are documents that you're familiar with. Some of them are, not so recent, but they're oldies but goodies. Our 1995 Integrated Resources Plan, you'll hear more about that. And then we're also building a lot of our analyses and thinking on our 2015 Urban Water Management Plan. And also, you will recall the significant work done by staff in recent years related to the water fix business case and thinking about that project. And so much of the work done for that is being considered as well. So the purpose of tonight's workshop, we're going to be reviewing the significant upcoming changes affecting our water supplies and demands. We have a very capable team here tonight to share that with you. We're also going to discuss some of the key planning objectives, criteria, and elements, and this is going to really help provide input to the planning analyses and the technical work that we need to do prior to making some of these bigger decisions. And last but not least, we're going to obtain feedback and direction for the Water Efficiency Master Plan that's going on right now, and that's something where we're really looking forward to a good discussion. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Nizer, our Manager of Water Supply and Planning, to talk about upcoming changes affecting our water supplies. Go back here to be in the camera.
I know. Good evening. I think Laura suggested this already, but I'll reiterate this. A lot of material tonight. We are looking for a lot of feedback. It might feel punishing at times, but it's going to be important to understand to sufficient depth to get the feedback that we need to guide us over the next couple of years. And we are going to be talking about board policies. So these are things that only the board can really provide direction for us on. So we'll start by reminding the board and a few members of the public or folks who are new here about some of the changing conditions in our water supply portfolio that are germane to this entire discussion. We'll start with the changes in our water supply portfolio, most notably our imported supplies. This is a refresher for the board, but for the benefit of the new people here. There's a program called Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan run by the state board. This is about a 15-year-old program. We refer to it as the Bay Delta Plan. And the objective of this is for the state board to determine and establish flow requirements for the health and benefit of the Delta ecosystem. This process is finally at the sort of action stage where recommendations have come from the state board. And we're in a status right now where the default standards that the state has provided, recommended, are
in a state of sort of quasi-effect. And certainly in our San Francisco supply, they've actually already been adopted. They have to be finalized by DWR. However, right now they're the default assumptions. There is a process for affected agencies or parties to produce a voluntary agreement to help to try to strive to meet the goals of improved Delta ecosystem. And so it's sort of a negotiating process. But either way, we anticipate there to be a pretty substantial impact to our imported supplies. ACWD is 60% dependent on imported supplies, so even a small percent impact on that would be fairly significant. The timeline for that is nigh. October 15th, we anticipate the Department of Water Resources to make its determination on the sufficiency of the voluntary agreements. If not, the default assumptions will be in effect. And the next step will be in the summer of next year to actually release CEQA for public comment. The other sort of significant timeline right now is as we prepare for our urban water management plan cycle, we are waiting on the what we call the delivery capability report from the Department of Water Resources. And that report provides the official data that's used by agencies like ACWD to prepare our urban water management plan in 2020. It is the default data that we have to use. If we were to not use it, we would have to provide a case as to why. Department of Water Resources data set will be reliant on the best information out there with expectations for the Delta, so we fully expect the Delta plan recommendations to be reflected in this data set. That draft document should be coming out about the same timeline as DWR's negotiations with the voluntary agreements. So within a few months' time, we should have a significant greater level of understanding of what our uncertainties are. I know that sounds funny. They still remain uncertainties, but we will have a better understanding of what the uncertainties are. Another thing that Delta plan, the capability report may or may not have is reflection of what's changed with WaterFix. And as Laura mentioned at the top, we don't call it WaterFix anymore. It's been rescinded. The project is gone. We did our best to scour and take the word WaterFix out. I will probably slip it in. When I say that, I do mean Delta conveyance. There is still a proposal to provide conveyance through the Delta. We hope that the DCR will include that information. So, to establish for the planning workshops, which the board will be partaking in over the next year and a half, we wanted to make sure we're all on the same page with an understanding of what we're talking about. We are going to be using data that reflects an assumption of the Bay Delta plan in effect. As we presented during the WaterFix business case, we have something we refer to as the ECHO-SAID assumption. We're going to digest that all. We're going to be saying ECHO-SAID all the time. Right now, that is our default assumption for future imported water supply reliability. What that means is, and we're using this as a proxy until we have new data, ECHO, the acronym means existing conveyance high outflow. This is a specific data set we have from the state. It reflects a higher environmental outflow requirement on the state water project, directly offsetting our access to that supply. And similarly, SED stands for the Supplemental Environmental Document, and that reflects the 40% unimpaired winter and spring flow criteria on the Hetch Hetchy system. Big hit to our water supply system, and we'll see the significance of that later. On the flip side, the balance out for water supply is our water demand assumptions. We will be starting with our existing forecast from the 2015 Urban Water Management Plan, and we're going to be making reference to year 2040. We refer to 2040 as a stand-in for a build-out, maximum potential of demand. Water supply investments are very long-term. They're not just a 20-year investment. They are 30, 50-year, 100-year investment. So we want to be sure that we are analyzing our ability to provide water for the maximum potential demand that we anticipate through the Tri-City area. So when we say 2040, we don't necessarily mean the year 2040, but we planners, both at the city as well as ACWD and the state, typically default to saying, hey, 30 years out, everything will be built, and the last time we updated this, that was 2040. When we do the next urban water management plan, we may call it 2050. Simply refers to complete build-out, maximum demand. Part of that assumption in our demand forecast includes, as is published in our urban water management plan, an assumption of 1,000 acre-feet of additional conservation programming to be achieved. So that's conservation achieved through investment by the district, hard work by our conservation staff to bring that demand down. So we're assuming that there's 1,000 acre-feet of additional conservation from that. What's new for this analysis, and pursuant to action earlier this month, I think it was, the board submitting or approving an RFP be released for an AMI program, we are making an assumption about an additional AMI-enabled conservation benefit, which we have been presenting to the board, of an additional 5% conservation. So that's programmatic conservation enabled through this action that the board took. That equates to about 2,500 acre-feet per year. What we are not including right now is the effect of any additional conservation required to meet the current legislation enacted by the governor, making conservation a California way of life. And the details of that are still yet to be determined. We feel fairly confident between these prior two assumptions that we're going to be able to comply with that. But this is a regulatory compliance that's out there, and we want to make sure the board's aware that we are including it in our planning. And to speak to that is Ms. Nevins, who is our water conservation supervisor, and she'll give us a quick overview on the legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Neiser. So I'm going to give you a quick overview on the legislation. So it started out with the drought of 2012 to 2016, which really hit us in 2014. There was an executive order issued by Governor Brown, then governor at the time, that called for making conservation a California, or making conservation the California way of life. It's a mouthful. The executive order listed some goals for doing that, and some recommendations for achieving that statement. So some of the goals were to use water more wisely. They're all listed right in here, this area. So using water more wisely, eliminating water waste, strengthening local drought resilience, improving agricultural water use efficiency, and drought planning. So there was a framework that was put together that was based on that executive order, and it had recommendations to achieve these goals. So there were some of the recommendations that there were existing authorities to carry out, but there were some that there was not existing authorities for the State Water Board, State Water Resources Control Board to carry out. And so they developed this legislation, which was adopted in 2018, SB 606 and AB 1668, to provide those authorities and move forward with that. Now, in this framework, there was the development of water conservation objectives, or new water efficiency targets, that urban water agencies would have to calculate and then meet. So that was one of the new authorities, was to create these objectives and then be able to enforce those objectives. So this is what the water use objective calculations look like. What is known is that right now in the calculation is 55 gallons per person per day for indoor residential use. So that's what we do know. However, that may be subject to change. There's going to be some studies that are going to be done over the next couple of years, and they're looking into that to see if that's the appropriate level. It will also go down to 52.5 gallons per person per day between 2025. So the 55 is until 2025, and then 2025 to 2030 it goes to 52.5 gallons per day, and then to 50 after 2030. Now, yeah.
I just thought of this. Has anybody ever done a study where they've taken a
single-family home, an older one, built in the 50s, 40s, i.e., there's one right now for sale on Aberrao Nile. I'm sure it's going to get demoed and replaced. Has anybody ever ID'd what the water use was from the original home to what has been the use of the one that was built in its place? Just a curiosity.
Well, we do have data that we use when we look at older homes, prior to 1992 when the toilet law went into effect, so 3.5 gallons per flush or greater toilets, and then we assume a certain amount of use, a certain number of people in the household, and we compare it to what an upgraded home would look like. So the efficient home is like 36, like a super efficient home, indoors 36 gallons per person per day, but I can't recall exactly what we were looking at for the older homes. Do you remember?
Our baseline's been about 60. But can I clarify, are you asking about putting in higher density and multiple units
Well,
in the
I'm
same spot?
expecting higher density in all likelihood, but
Yeah, we've looked at both of those. Yeah. And a modified, long and short, is a modified home that's upgraded will be just as efficient as a new home. But it'll still have a big lot and potentially a lot more outdoor use. We do see if you take an acre of land that has old, small number of homes, and you put it into current density, the total water demand on that acre of land will be a bit higher, if that's the question. Because we'll be putting more total people in the same amount of space.
The outdoor use will be much
that
higher.
was much higher.
Yeah.
By population, are you taking into account the commercial population, or are you going to ignore hotels, golf courses?
It's the population for the service area, which is like 353,000.
That's residential only, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you ignore any sort of transient effects?
Right. So this standard here won't take that into effect. They're going to capture some of that other use in these other standards. So the and I'll get into that a little bit more detail because it's pretty complicated. So the indoor use they've established that, but that could change. And then the outdoor use. Oh yeah.
So we only conduct an official census once every 10 years. So if we experience some massive population growth within that 10-year time frame, is the state going to somehow adjust or will the state take into account that population growth, or how do they account for?
We adjust our population based on what we receive, and we grow it every year. And so we will be using that data to do the calculation, and it will be an annual calculation.
Okay, so it's not reliant on...
The Department of Finance prepares an annual estimate of population and it's built off of the census.
Okay.
And that's an estimate every year, and at that 10th year when the new census data comes out, they recalibrate it.
Understood. Okay.
The interesting point is we found with the last sentence, there's an error of about 3 to 5% of service area. So it's relevant. We raised that with DWR.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. So the outdoor target is going to be for residential water use, outdoor, and commercial, industrial, and institutional customers with dedicated landscape accounts. The standard that's going to go into the calculation is to be determined. There's going to be some work groups and studies on this, so that's still in the works. Water loss is also going to be part of the calculation. That is also being studied and to be determined. So, as I mentioned, there's going to be work groups that are going to come up with recommendations, and then that's going to go to the State Water Resource Control Board for rulemaking. So essentially, this is a water budget for us, and so we would compare this. So we would look at what we should be using, based on population and other parameters we throw into this, and then we would compare it to those uses, what's actually going on in our service area. So a little bit more on kind of how they're going to come up with these recommendations. This is a timeline for implementation. for establishing these new standards and methodologies to calculate the objectives. There are 11 work groups representing all these different areas, and 8 of those work groups are for urban water use. So there's 3 there's wholesale water loss, county drought, water shortage contingency planning, and agricultural management plans. So that's we're not paying a lot of attention to that, but there's these other 8 work groups that we're going to be monitoring the activities and the discussion, and they're going to be, some of them are going to meet monthly, some of them are going to meet bi-monthly. So the staff is planning to stay informed of what's going on in these work groups. Some of them tie together, like the water use studies group will be tying into another. So this is like an element, but there's several work groups that are represented in this study process. And so there's 3 that have already started and they've been working on this. There's a model water efficient landscape ordinance work group that's been active for a while. Landscape area measurements work group that's working on the outdoor calculation. Then there's also a water loss control group that's been already meeting. There are these new work groups that are going to work on, so the water use studies group and the standards, methodologies, and performance measures group that are going to look at indoor use and commercial, industrial, institutional performance measures. So they're going to be looking at what we can do with commercial sites to reduce water use instead of throwing them into the budget, because it's super complicated to estimate what a business should be using. So they're going to instead come up with performance measures for that group. There's also an urban water management plan guidebook work group, an annual water supply and demand assessment for annual reporting, and then also data streamlining. Since we're going to be doing a ton of reporting, they're trying to find the common parameters, and they're aware of all of this extra reporting and trying to figure out a way to streamline it. So, again, we're going to just stay on top of the work group process. We have put our name in the hat to participate in a couple of the work groups. We haven't heard yet. So we'll be playing a more active role. And it's estimated, just my best guess is that it'll be could be as much as 5 meetings a month, that could be as long as a half day. So we'll be sharing a lot of that within our division. Let's see, so this is a little bit of a more simplified timeline. So what I just showed you is just this process of developing the recommendations for the standards, and then going through the rulemaking process, and then we would be reporting our water use objective for the first time in November of 2023. We think we will know how to calculate it pretty well. Like, we'll have enough information to know what we're looking at. Probably at the end of 2021. And because all the standards are supposed to be recommended to the State Water Resource Control Board by the fall of 2021. So, so we might even know a little bit sooner than that. Let's see, so there's, again, lots of reporting. First annual reports will be due in June of 2022. If we're not in compliance in 2023, we could receive an informational order. If we are not in compliance in 2025, we could receive a conservation order, and civil liability could be imposed if we're not complying with an order. And 2027 is the year where it's like, okay, you've got to be in compliance. What's going on? And we could really be in trouble if we're not meeting our objectives.
Compliance is determined by the total aggregate use across the entire district, not
exactly
individual accounts.
Exactly, yes. It's a total water budget calculation. not on an individual basis, not house by house, or even by those elements, the indoor, outdoor, and water loss. They add it all up, what we should be doing, and then we add up those uses, and they look and see where we're at. All right. Now, Thomas will come, Mr. Nizer will come and Thomas.
Mr. Nizer, great. Great. Thank you, Stephanie. So, moving on. Well, actually, we should pause. Are there any remaining questions for Stephanie about the pending legislation and the implementation? Okay. So with that, we wanted to summarize the basis for what we're going to be doing over the next year and a half planning assumptions. Key are reliability assumptions. We will be, until we have a better data set, we will be assuming the ECHO set data set as a proxy for implementation of the Bay Delta Plan. Our future demands are assuming AMI implementation. We're talking about a year 2040 build-out level, so whether it happens in 5 years, 10 years, is almost a moot point. We're going to assume for now, as I mentioned earlier, that AMI-enabled conservation will address the Macon conservation legislation targets. That additional conservation that this district has already taken action to put into effect with adopting or planning to move towards AMI should make things pretty easy for us to comply with that. We're assuming. So from there, any questions about background assumptions before we move on? We're going to start getting more into the meat of the planning. Okay, great. So the next section, we'd like to review the guiding policies for ACWD's integrated resources planning. This is the crux of what we'll be talking about over the next few workshops. There are key elements to the integrated resource plan that the board adopted in 1995 that we believe are going to form constraints in our ability to effectively plan and make a selection on the potential investments in additional water supply, which is why we're here tonight. There's a lot to be discussed. We are going to take on one of the meatier topics tonight. It's going to be, we got a short list, but it's going to be involved. But staff will need this input from the board to provide some guidance back to the board with technical analyses as we look at these interim decision-making opportunities with ongoing studies. We have a potable reuse study. We have a Los Vaqueros expansion study. Those things are going to have action points that come prior to the 2025 Water Supply Master Plan scheduled update. And so we're going to need this input to get us through this sort of bridge. So we've been calling this actually an interim planning policies. Let's start by reviewing the basics from the 1995 Integrated Resource Plan. For the benefit of our guests, what we call an Integrated Resource Plan is what typically is called a Water Supply Master Plan. It's sort of how do we plan to meet the demand for water today and into the future. It delineates what we have and what we need to develop to get to that place where we can meet certain goals. For the benefit of the board, that plan started with the then acting board in 1995, developing policy objectives in combination with criteria, and those were used to evaluate the water supply alternative options at that time. Those objectives and criteria were set through a lengthy process, and we'll probably be doing the same thing starting around 2023, moving into 2025. It includes public input. There'll be public stakeholder work groups, things like that. Community affairs will be actively involved with that sort of stuff, as they were back in 1995. Well, we didn't have a community affairs group. The next best thing. And that will be used to develop, so the criteria, the objectives and criteria are then used to develop a portfolio of strategy elements. So those are now projects that are used to meet the policy objectives. Okay, so I'm just going to use this terminology a lot tonight. This next flow chart just kind of explains it a little bit more cleanly in the process. We start by setting a policy objective. We're going to be talking about our reliability goals tonight, so we're using that example. So what's the goal? We want to have a reliable supply. From there, the process develops evaluation criteria. ACWD's criteria is to have no more than a 10% shortage with a frequency of no more than once in 30 years. And there's a secondary one, which is to avoid frequent smaller shortages. And once these two things are established, they then evaluated strategy elements, for example, conservation, off-site water banking, desalination, recycled water. What are the projects that can come together to meet this reliability goal?
And then just to remind the board, and for those of us who were here in 1995, a number of projects were outlined in that IRP. Some of these conservation, off-site water banking, semi-tropic, desal. Since the 20-plus years since then, the district has been checking those boxes and implementing those projects, and that was the roadmap for the last quarter century, almost, for the district. But it's time in this new day to begin the process of developing the next long-term master plan for the district. But I just wanted to point out, we've been very busy over the last 20 years and accomplishing a lot of things. We've also received new information in that time period, and here's where we are.
Thanks. And actually, we might as well mention, really the only key recommendation that we haven't implemented from the 1995 IRP is building an alternative non-potable water supply, which was originally scheduled to come online by 2020. And we'll hit on that a little bit later. But that's really the only element from the original plan that has not been completed. And that was deferred for upon consideration and for good reasons, which we'll talk about later. So any questions about the flow here? Okay. So we have 6 overall objectives that we try to meet. Costs, keep it low. Reliability, keep it high. Water quality, comply with public health, obviously, but we have aesthetic water quality standards, which are secondary quality standards. Not secondary in terms of importance, but they're non-regulatory, they're aesthetic. We have environmental impacts, avoid or be able to fully mitigate. Maximize local control, so to reduce our dependence on imported supplies, and mitigate or avoid risk. And each one of these has got a fair amount of detail. Each one has multiple criteria to it. Young Devin over here, we've decided the board might want a full list of what the criteria for the objectives are, so we just provided a printout for the benefit of the board. We're not going to go into the full detail of it. It's really for your reference later, because often people say, well, what does this mean, water quality? What are we talking about when we say water quality? So we just want to make sure everyone's got a nice, quick, easy reference for that information. So there's the handout. So what are these objectives? What do we do with these objectives? Well, each objective was sort of given a subjective weight, which one's more important than the other. You can imagine reliability is a pretty high objective. There are trade-offs between the different objectives. Great. Compromises are required when we evaluate the options between maximizing one objective or the other. But overall, the goal is to optimize a plan by maximizing as many of the objectives as possible. We had thought about putting it on 8.5 by 11. That's too small already. So obviously the trade-offs come in place. I usually tell folks you could very well take the cost objective, minimizing cost, put it on this side of the scale, and take the other 5 objectives and put it on the other. The point being, you could maximize our reliability, we could have the best water quality, we could have 0 environmental impacts, or the lowest impacts possible, maximum control and lowest risk, if we really wanted to throw all the money in the world at it. So each one of these has a solution that just has a lot of the dollar sign and a lot of zeros behind it. So the trick is, how do you get the best bang for the buck that is a reasonable buck to spend on your water supply portfolio? Any questions about any objectives before we move on? Okay, great. So that's the rubric that we typically use to look at new supply options. Now, over the past couple of years with the water supply alternative study that we did during the drought, also during the water fix business case, we've heard from the board potential new policy objectives, and I want to discuss these tonight and get the board's consideration here. So I'm looking for your input, direct input. Over the past few years, we've brought in some new basically objectives that aren't official in our policies, and it's hard for us to understand how important they are to the board. Starting with what I personally believe is the single most important one, is climate readiness. We are now, this is a term that didn't exist in the 90s. I think it meant, is your air conditioning working before the summer gets here? So climate readiness now is a project ready to either withstand the known anticipated effects of climate change, or can it maybe even address some of the impacts that we anticipate? I think we don't need to get into the depths of what climate change means, but we know sea level rise. We have an aquifer right on the bay. We know we're going to have impacts from sea level rise. We're going to have change precipitation. We don't necessarily know what it means, but we also know the delta is going to be subject to stresses from sea level rise and change precipitation. We're looking at investments that are 50-year plus, and we know the effects of climate change are only going to get more severe with the decades to come. So I would like to pause with each one of these and kind of get an input from the board. Did we hear you right that this is an important consideration for future water supply investments? And I literally would like to get input from every board member if we'd like to discuss these one by one, or maybe a show of a head nod or something that we could confirm that this is, and I would personally say that this would be a binary objective. A new water supply investment must be climate ready. So not a ranking necessarily of like, hey, this is okay, but it'll fail once 2 feet of sea level rise happens. We need it to be able to withstand the known effects. We haven't really defined a timeline. I guess that would be part of this, sort of within 50 years, 100 years. So could we get input from the board? Could we just maybe run down the line here? Any concerns?
Looking for a feeling at this point.
I have no input right now.
No input?
I want to see everything.
Sure.
I mean,
We're not initiating new policy here,
Sure.
just to be clear. We're looking for, when we're analyzing options, we're just going to add a checklist item. Is this a climate-ready project?
Just to clarify for me, the climate readiness is more on how climate change is going to impact our system, and the environmental impacts that we have currently listed in our policy objectives is more how our system is going to impact
The environment.
Okay.
Correct. Okay. This is, we know there's certain things that are going to happen. The bay is going to come up.
Yeah.
Precipitation patterns are going to change. Do we want to ensure that any investment in water supply will work with those known impacts from climate change?
Yes.
Okay, so I think climate readiness is really important because it could potentially impact a large percentage of our water supply. In addition to that, I think if you're looking at projects, not just new projects, but also existing projects, if we are retrofitting a plant, if we are putting in a new pipeline, we should also build in a consideration because every one of our infrastructure, our hard goods, is a long-term investment for this agency and for our customers, right? So when we start thinking about bringing money, even with retrofitting a project or upgrading a project, we should think about the impact, what would happen 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, 50 years down the road. So yes, it is a checkbox item for me.
I mean, I'm ready to jump up and scream and run out of the room. So, yeah, it's a check the box. I think the concern is the unknown. And, I mean, we are a semi-coastal community on the bay directly. The bay will have an effect. Rise on the bay will have an effect. You don't stop the ocean with a seawall. Whether a civil engineer will tell you that or not, an ocean engineer will tell you, don't worry about it, you're not going to do it. So, I've been out of the business for a while, but I'm nervous. And the other problem you have is the delta, and what's going to happen to that. I don't think it's going to get any better. I think it's only going to get worse. Restrictions are only going to get stronger. And we are not in a very strong political position, nor do I see us being any stronger politically in the near future probably long-term future. So we have to be ready to defend. And so, yes, that's my answer.
Thank you. Yeah, it might be helpful if I give you guys an example. About 15 years ago when we were looking at regional desalination concepts, several of those concepts were situated actually in mudflats today. Right now, anybody looking at putting a $150 million plant at a foot above sea level in unstable land would tell you you're crazy. That's an example of having a climate-ready project. That project is now officially something that nobody would pursue. So I don't know if that's helpful for clarifying what we're talking about here. Great. Next criteria, and these again are things that have risen from the WaterFix business case. We don't have an existing rubric for them, so we want to make sure that we are capturing them in some fashion, even though they don't fit in with the old ones very well. I mean, risk is in there, but risk, when you start throwing these in, it's about 3% weighting factor. The next one is resiliency. We've spoken a lot about this, and this we're talking about our ability to withstand earthquakes or other known natural disasters. So, for example, WaterFix. I hate to use a specific example, but WaterFix, one of the business case elements for WaterFix, is that if the delta is wiped out from either one of several major fault lines or through flooding induced by climate change, that the conveyance facility would still be able to deliver water in a sort of act of God, if you will. So we don't have a criteria that says a project must be resilient, and it's also very hard to put a weight on. So what I would suggest is we continue to include this as we have, as sort of being a plus. That this is a positive, and a system would improve our resiliency. So now let me use one example that has come up quite a bit from directors, and it doesn't happen to be here, who often refers to if we lose the delta, if we improve the delta, his concern is the South Bay Aqueduct is not seismically resilient. So what's the point of improving the delta if we don't have the pipeline working? And the argument is good. It's a logical one for sure. But it's a little bit like the weakest link in a chain, right? You lose one link, the chain's not effective. If you lose two links, you got to fix two links before you can get the chain back in action. And it's the same thing with our water supply system. So each little component that's slightly more resilient is going to shorten the amount of time it'll take for us collectively to get back into full service. And so that's sort of the way we've been looking at resilience. It's a new area in the water resources community where we've combined reliability and resiliency to the point where we had to separate the terms. So we're proposing to keep resiliency in our new sort of expanding matrix and just call it a plus. Sort of, is it a resilient alternative? And that's a net positive if we have it. We don't know how good it is, but we know it'll be better than having one more facility that's certain to be out or highly likely to be out of commission after an earthquake. Would the board like to see resiliency continued in the matrices that we bring during these analyses? I'm seeing head nodding. Question?
I guess I'll say yes. However, in most of your discussion,
and I'm sorry I use WaterFix as the example, but it applies to all of them.
But in most of your discussion, you define resiliency as how would that hard good survive an earthquake. I think as part of resiliency determination, you should also consider having more local control of water.
Well, we have local control. That's the beauty. We already have local control in our rubric.
Right. So just keep that in mind, that don't hinge everything on infrastructure, but if the trade-off is if we could develop a new local supply versus, I say, fix the South Bay Aqueduct, for same amount of water, I would say your resiliency scale, your plus and minus, I would say the local water supply will get 2 pluses.
That is a great distinction there. We just hang out on that for a moment.
Okay.
So local control is already a high importance in our supply portfolio planning. So we can look at 2 examples since I went down the path already with WaterFix. WaterFix is a resiliency project as well as climate ready. Our best local control project we've identified is indirect potable reuse. We've selected indirect potable reuse as having a negative resiliency because in an earthquake situation, we are dependent on a sanitary system that isn't seismically resilient and in fact has a substantial amount of clay pipe. So we expect that as a supply, while it's got great local control factor, to actually, we rated that as having low resiliency. We expect that supply and that system to not be available for quite a while after an earthquake. So I don't know if that, we can at least get a sense of where these trade-offs are.
I would agree with that in an earthquake scenario,
Yeah.
but in a slightly different drought scenario, that might be a different picture.
That's reliability, absolutely right. Okay. Yeah, so that's great. That's why we have to separate resiliency from reliability. Reliability, we're talking about just hydrologic reliability. Is, under normal conditions, variable only really being weather, is the water supply available? Resiliency is act of God, earthquakes, floods, things that we are anticipating to happen, but don't know when. Would the board like to see this topic continued as a checklist item on scenarios that we look at? Nodding, thank you. And then the last one is an interesting one, and I had a hard time coming up with the right term for this. We went between enhanced flexibility and maybe future ready. There are projects out there that don't neatly fit into our project, our rubric, our 6 objectives, that provide a flexibility that we think will be of greater value in the future, but they don't really do anything for us right now. Okay? So we're not necessarily sure what the future looks like, but for example, there's contract amendments out with the state, and we're looking at moving toward a liberalization of water markets, where we would be able to outright sell surplus water and not have to get into complex extended year transfer options. So if we look at a project that would have enhanced flexibility, that would give us the benefits of perhaps reducing costs, improving reliability through some unconventional means, there's a positive value in there. It just doesn't fit into our 6 objectives. And so this is another one that I consider to be, here's something new. Here's something we think will be, we don't need right now, but maybe a very valuable asset moving into the future. And similar to resiliency, I'd like to continue to include this one as a plus, as a just, is it more flexible? Is it providing new opportunities for the district than what we have now? And if so, just give it a plus. It's not a weighting, it's just an extra little positive that this element would carry. I don't know if that made a lot of sense. I'd be happy to provide some examples if that would be helpful. Okay. So the best example right now, and since we're already talking about other projects, when we look at the Los Vaqueros project, it doesn't do anything for us right now. It doesn't do anything that we can't do already with our existing facilities. It gives us a little bit of benefit of some south of Delta water storage. But one of the great benefits there is you are now commingling your water with 15 other parties. And each party has multiple sources of water. And so now that resource becomes what I like to think of like a currency exchange center, where you can go in and bring money from any country and buy money from any other country. If we had something like that, it would enhance our ability to trade and sell water with all those other partners and all their other supplies. That's a future benefit. We don't have it now. We don't need it, but it might be really handy. So that's really kind of the example, the poster child for enhanced flexibility or future ready. That's helpful. I see some nodding. Okay. Any questions on this one? Would we like to? Sorry.
You described these as check marks or pluses.
Yeah.
As if they were just strictly a binary decision.
Correct.
I mean, failure is. I think all these are probably statistical. Meaning, not all the total supply lines will be broken all over the place. There'll be some localization and so forth. So maybe the evaluation between these should involve some kind of statistical rating on that, so that the true trade-off would then become more apparent.
I would actually defer to our engineering group at this point, where we do have a sort of seismic resiliency study, and we are investing in things to improve our ability to withstand an earthquake using those exact principles. They could certainly be transferred over to the supply options as well. I definitely agree. One issue we have right now is that we are working with board-adopted policies, and until we develop a new water supply master plan, we can't really pin down critical decision-making objectives. We're trying to incorporate sort of the evolution of what's going on out there today to provide some additional direction in our process. And I'm not sure if that makes much sense, but basically the board is not setting new policy, and our legal counsel might have a better way to describe what our constraints are here. But we can't just add in new criteria and define those weights for that decision-making process outright at this time. I'm not sure if that helps.
Yeah, so there's kind of two issues in play. Developing a new long-term plan is going to take some time and a lot of analysis and a lot of what-if scenarios. So unfortunately, it's likely that the district is going to be forced to make some decisions in the near term before we complete all that. So Mr. Neiser is just kind of polling the board here just to get some initial ideas of what level of interest in this potential criteria is, which may help us in the near term, as the board is going to frankly struggle with some decisions that they would prefer to have more information on and what it means. In the long term, for the long-term plan, what we've done in the past, and I imagine we would do for this iteration, is use all this criteria and then package up various potential paths, where maybe we do this suite of projects, or we do this suite of projects, and then we rate how the district is addressing these criteria, and going statistically on it, to come up with scores and use that to assist the board in making some pretty important long-term decisions. So we've got the near-term issues, and then we've got the long-term planning. We do have existing criteria, but I don't think we're going to, with our existing board-adopted policy, but we're going to have to think a little differently than that in the short term because of the new information. Things happened during the drought that we didn't expect, that wasn't part of our planning. So it's like those kind of issues that will have to come into play. So I think this is the beginning of that conversation. So the board's going to have to make decisions on, is the district going to be a participant in whatever the Delta conveyance project turns out to be, which we don't even know what that is right now. Is the district going to buy storage capacity in a Los Vaqueros expansion project in Contra Costa? Those are sort of the near-term things that we're going to have, because there's schedule constraints on things like bond funding that require decisions to be made in the near term. So that's what we're struggling with here, and this is the beginning of those conversations, so ultimately we'll be in a position where we can make thoughtful and careful decisions. Does that help?
Yeah, I just thought I'd quick clarify, it's not a check mark.
Exactly.
You could evaluate this.
Yeah, everything in the waterway is on a spectrum. There's nothing that's digital. So, and it's all like a whack-a-mole game. You can deal with climate readiness, but the cost of that might be more than you think your rate can afford. So it's got to be optimized. And I totally agree with you that it's not yes or no. It's going to be, we could get a little more at this cost and package that. Make sense? Thanks.
And by the way, your observation's spot on correct. So enhanced flexibility, would you like to see this included in the matrices? So coming back to Los Vaqueros example, it's very expensive. The only time we know for sure that will help us is if we lose the delta. Maybe that's once in 50 years. It's not going to save us money. It may open up new doors of future flexibility. So that's an example of where we need to have this. This is the additional value that a project has that doesn't fit into the existing policies.
Right, so...
I'm sorry to keep looking at you, but you have a
I
concerned
know.
look on your face.
I am trying to gather my thoughts here. All right. So I think all the objectives, the 6 plus the new ones, are viable and something we should carry. But as all the discussion has alluded to, it really have to boil, when we have to make a decision, it really boils down to cost, it boils down to statistics, how much are we willing to pay for what. Right, that's the bottom line at the very end. But for purpose of this discussion, for you to prepare your project and evaluate the project, I think this is fine. You should add the flexibility in because we benefited from the Elizabeth Heroes exchange during the drought. However, if we really want to implement this, the cost is pretty horrendous. Right. So this is one of those, I say, keep the concept of intense flexibility in your discussion, but just understand at the end when we start actually looking at the actual project or widget, it would be statistics, it would be the number, it would be actual cost and benefit, and what does our customer get.
Since it's your decision, absolutely it will.
Thank you. Sheesh.
That's exactly correct. I mean, the trade-offs will be there, and that will be the board's, that will be the data points that the board needs to
So I think we need to
basically-
kind of pull us back up a level higher. We're actually talking about principle, right? That's what you're presenting, is the objective is a higher principle. We're actually not making decisions on a project. These are just the guidelines that we're talking about
Correct.
to select the project,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
Okay. Got it.
So, I did hear you say yes. Would you actually like to say yes?
Yes.
We'd like to see this continued. Any other questions or input we could jump on? Val? Okay. Director Akbari? Director Sethy?
No additional comments. I think it's valuable.
To keep that information. Director Sethy? any-
Yes to all 3.
Oh, yes, all 3. Great, thank you. Wonderful. So with that, we're going to get into some meaty stuff soon, so we'll probably do a break. I think we've got one nice little transition slide here that we can hit up, which is that the IRP requires periodic review. We've hit this bullet already, but I'll just read it out loud to sort of validate the discussion we just had over the past 20 minutes. The objectives and the criteria and the strategy elements that from the original IRP, they all remain sound. These are the same. You pull out 300 water supply master plans, and our 6 objectives are, at least 5 of them are going to be in there, and that's true. I've worked in multiple countries. I mean, it's the same principles everywhere. But they do require refinements to reflect things that change, and the changes that we've seen happening and are going to see happen more are changes in our supplies, in our demands, in our existing facilities. We don't have TP1 anymore, for example. It's now a decision point. Regulations, the Delta Plan, the Delta Water Quality Plan, technology, and also public sentiment. These things have all changed since 1995. Public sentiment, 20 years ago, if we were out on Alameda Creek, people would yell at us about spending money on fish. Now when we're out there, people are yelling at us to hurry up and build these things. We see more drought-tolerant gardens in some neighborhoods than lawns nowadays. Those reflect changes in public sentiment. We have reviewed strategy elements in the past, and we've modified our plan in 2006 and 2011. We've pushed out our decision to do recycled water. We just forestalled that. We've changed our direction in conservation planning. We changed the size of our offsite banking. We accelerated that investment. But this time we are going to be looking at the core things, the objectives and the criteria as well, and this is really where the meat is. So with that, it's a great time if we want to take a quick, maybe 5 or 10 minute break before we get into the fun stuff.
5:15.
5:15, great.
Start the boilers up.
Great. We don't have any procedural thing we need to do? Gavels or anything for a break?
No.
Great.
We're reconvening at 5:18.
Nice. Wonderful. Well, thank you for your input on that past one. That's a nice primer for where we're headed. The next section is to start to tackle a key constraint that we have identified through the water fix business case analyses over the past few years that is, quite frankly, 100% of the reason we're doing these workshops is this next topic. And that's why we want to take this one topic and give it full attention. This is the big one. We're going to be talking about both objectives of Do we need to wait for a second?
I'm missing one there. Yeah. I think we can continue.
Okay. So we'll be talking about objectives and criteria throughout these workshops. Certainly in October we're going to take on some more of them, but we wanted to tackle the biggest one first, which is our level of service or our reliability criteria. First we got to start with some definitions. I'm going to use both of these terms tonight, so I want to make sure we understand what they are. Level of service versus reliability. In the IRP we use the term reliability. Very straightforward what that means. How reliable is our water supply? Not talking resiliency, not talking emergencies, but just the water supply that you're counting on, given its natural, predictable hydrologic capabilities of snow and rain and the ability to get the water from where it lands to where we need it. That's what we refer to as our reliability. And we use the terms, we look at it as a shortfall during a drought. So we defined in the IRP reliability, and we have a criterion that says not more than 10%, not more than 10%, and with a frequency of 1 in 30 years. We have a secondary criteria of small droughts and not very frequent, without metrics. The industry standard term is typically more level of service. We'll be using this term a little bit more frequently because I'm younger in the industry, and so I use the new terms, not the older terms. So, level of service refers to what percent of normal year demand. Sorry.
Did we just cut this?
You weren't here for 1995 either. I'm sure of that. When we talk about level of service, we talk about what percent of normal year demand can be met during a drought. So, for example, our reliability target as a level of service is a 90% level of service based on our IRP goal. So it's kind of a pessimistic or optimistic scenario. We're either 10% empty or we're 90% full. Level of service, it's the single most important part of our demand supply portfolio. So in order for us to discuss this topic, we're going to have to get really into the weeds for a little bit about how ACWD and how the water industry analyzes level of service or reliability. So I'm going to get a little nerdy here for a bit. Bear with me, ask questions. It's important that we all understand this before we get into the discussion with the board. So, our planning process, the data that we use every 5 years as the basis for our urban water management plan, and then for all of our optimization studies that we do through the integrated resource planning model, begins with our single largest supply, which is Department of Water Resources. Between our average annual supply and our use of semi-tropic bank during dry years, it's huge. Our planning begins with data simulated by the Department of Water Resources that shows the capability of the State Water Project to deliver water under different hydrologic conditions. And every 2 years, since the Monterey Accord, where the state committed to providing this reliability, every 2 years, the state puts together an assessment of how reliable is our system today and how reliable will it be in the future. And the future for them is always 30 years out. It's just like the city, it's just like us. It's a funny coincidence, but it works well. And now when I say today and in the future, what I mean is they tell us the reliability with today's current infrastructure as well as a reliability index in the future with future infrastructure. So for example, the new data set that we get this year may include an assumption about a conveyance improvement. If it does, future data set is going to look quite different. They'll also look at current and potential future regulations. So we also anticipate, DWR will give us a data set that anticipates the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan implementation. So again, we'll have potentially vastly different reliability data indexes for today's conditions and future conditions. And then they also look at today's current demands. How much are people pumping every year? How much water they have to move out of the Delta? And then they'll also to simulate a future, basically a stress test, where they just assume everybody wants 100% of their available table A, and they'll just send everybody as much as they can. It's a useful stress test on the system for us. Now, how do they do this? Well, what they do is they recreate the supply conditions for each year from the hydrologic period, I'm going to get nerdy here, from 1922 through 2003. So let's look at the current condition. When they provide, and we call this the planning hydrology, They will take today's demand for water throughout the state, everything that has, like whatever happened last year, the demands on the Delta, they will take that demand and they will simulate the hydrology for the period of 1922 through 2003 each year in that exact sequence and say, hey, if the demand was exactly the same every year as it is today, and if the infrastructure was exactly the same as it is today, in every one of those 82 years, what would be the Table A allocation? The Table A is the amount of water they give us every year. What would be that allocation in each of those 82 years? Now, why they do that is because it encapsulates a string of different hydrologic years. We've got extended dry periods, we've got single critically dry periods, we've got hyper wet periods, and it gives us a data set that we can then combine with other water supplies that we have and figure out how to use our system most effectively and plan for droughts. This also gives us an index to speak about, and I'm sure you've all heard this. If you're at an aqua meeting and they're talking about water fix or conveyance, somebody may say, hey, how does that do in 1977? So we're not talking about going back in time 41 years, 42 years, and seeing what would happen. They mean if we had the hydrology today that we had in 1977, what would be the benefit of this project? Okay? A couple other things this does for us is it gives us a common language to use throughout the state. The Central Valley Project uses the same planning hydrology that we use. And basically today, any agency that has an effect on the delta, so that includes San Francisco, because they divert substantial water upstream, that includes East Bay Mud, those agencies also use the same planning hydrology now. They don't need it, they're not subject to the Monterey Accord, but it gives a common index that all people who are involved in the delta can then speak to. Okay? Are there questions on this?
Yes, but I think it's on your next bullet.
Okay. Does that make a fair amount of sense? So when we say 1927 through 1932 drought, we don't mean what really happened back then in the days of horses and buggies and farming here. We mean if we had the weather from 1927 to 32, which is one of the critical dry periods, how would today's system behave? Okay. So now when they do the future projection, 30 years out, they will also reflect the anticipated future impacts from climate change. I'll point out, we mentioned earlier, 30 years from now, climate change is going to have this much impact. 50 years, it's a bit more. 100 years, it's a lot more. They do their best to come up with the best approximation for what the amount of sea level rise will be in 30 years' time, how much more carbon's in the air, what the snow elevation is, so how much of today's precipitation will now fall as rain instead of snow. They work that into that future scenario. It's very complex. Gesundheit. I guarantee you it's wrong, but it's the best sort of approximation we have today to start looking at these sorts of effects. It also allows us to comply with the Planning Act, which says we have to count known effects of climate change. And I feel there may be a question on this.
No, the question was actually with the 1922 to 2003 hydrologic period be representative for future forecasts because of climate change. Obviously, the runoff would be very different. So I assume by your bullet that somehow that would be accommodated because you used the word snowpack.
Actually, the more significant effect is the sea level rise in the delta. With an extra foot of sea level rise, which we expect in 30 years' time, the amount of water needed to maintain the X2 line, to keep the salt from in its particular zones where it needs to be, the amount of water needed to push that out to the bay goes up quite a bit.
Right.
So believe it or not, that's the bigger impact out of the elements that are factored
Not the
in.
need for storage,
That's in there.
Okay.
That's in there too. One other point, we recently had a drought. The new data set's going to extend through the year 2015. So we're going to have an extra 12 years plus one critically dry year. So that's going to be really useful for us. We're going to talk about that a little bit in a few more slides from now. So that's where we start with the state. And then you may hear, for your benefit, we don't use this, but when you're out at maybe aqua meetings and you hear about the Central Valley Index, that is basically taking that data set and defining how many dry years and wet years and average years there are in the Central Valley. We have a different definition because we have a different climate here at the coast. But it's relevant for projects in the Delta, notably Los Vaqueros. So, that's one of our major supplies. Another important supply is the San Francisco Public Utility System. They also simulate annual delivery capability over the same hydrology. They didn't used to. It's great for us that they do now. It allows us to do better modeling. They also do climate change impacts on their watershed in McCallamy Aqueduct. In the Tuolumne watershed. And ACWD, the remaining ingredient, we have two major local supplies. 30% is our groundwater basin. We simulate at a daily time step our recharge operations on Alameda Creek. We do the same period. And our simulations already include our current facilities, but also our planned future facilities. We use as the basis an adjusted Niles gauge flow. So we take the historic data, we modify it a little bit for known irregularities such as quarries and San Francisco transfers. And then we include San Francisco's future fishery releases, which are key to our bypass flow criteria at our facilities. On top of that, we simulate our future operations with our bypass flow requirements in place from the National Marine Fisheries Program. And that gives us a nice simulation of our groundwater basin. And then finally, there's Lake Del Valle. Lake Del Valle didn't exist in the first half of the 20th century, so what we've used and we share with Zone 7 is one common data set of modeled runoff based on historic rain gauge data, so we can predict the availability of Lake Del Valle supply. Now, I would like to... Question?
It adjusted Niles gauge for the daily recharge?
Yeah.
Do you account for the potential recapture project?
Not currently.
Okay.
If it becomes a real project, we will.
Okay.
But, it's a great question. We do account for it in our planning. When San Francisco gives us future capability, we've modified it to reduce their availability, assuming that they don't build recapture. So basically, their presumption about future reliability in our urban water management plan, we deducted a small amount to reflect the assumption that ACRP is not constructed.
Okay.
So I would like to, Director Huang, you asked a good question. You were talking about climate change. We know, the best of our guess, climate change will change weather patterns.
Right.
This is taking past actual weather and modifying it for known weather. They do use what we call GCMs, global climate circulation models. Forgetting exact acronym, but basically the global atmospheric models that simulate weather conditions with changed ocean temperatures. They are using those as the basis, so it will reflect changing patterns. It's not just, oh, the snow level will be higher, let's assume it melts faster. They're actually simulating sort of those changes to the best of their ability. There's 20 different scenarios, and they just kind of work them all together to pick a best guess. Okay, so what do we do with that? Well, ACWD, we then take that, we feed that into our Super Mojo machine, which is the Integrated Resources Planning model. And that's the model we use every day to optimize how we manage our system. That's the model that we use to decide when should we send water to semi-tropic and when should we bring it back. When is it okay to minimize the purchase of San Francisco supply? Very expensive. Or when should we buy a few thousand acre feet more at the expense of millions of dollars? So that's our integrated planning model. We use that as an optimization tool. Okay, can we move on to looking at some numbers? Everybody jazzed about some numbers? Great, so what does this look like? Let's look at our reliability output from the 2040 assumption, so build-out conditions, in our most recent urban water management plan. This is the one we did in 2015. So I'm just going to walk through this here. So across the bottom, this is a chart showing our shortages, our percent of demand shortfall. So these are percentages moving up. And you'll see the planning hydrology 1920 through 2003 reflected on here. And to highlight where 10% is, that's our existing board policy for shortage. And you'll notice that we have two peak years here, where we're right at 10% shortfall. That's in the 1927 to 32 drought. And this is a 1977 single critical year. And these are years where when we look at our optimization of our system and the known past hydrology, these are the years that we feel meet all of our criteria. It's not a coincidence that they hit just at the 10% mark. What you don't see in here is all the operations that go on before this to make sure that when we go into a drought, At the end of that drought, we meet all of our criteria and we don't exceed a 10% shortfall. That's the basis of our urban water management plan. You'll see we have a maximum 10% shortfall, just under, and it's roughly a once in 41 year recurrence interval. Recall our criteria is once in 30 years. So we're meeting our existing criteria for reliability, both in the magnitude and in the frequency. You'll also notice that there's little tiny blips down here, and we're going to have a handout for you on this, by the way, but I don't want to get people too distracted. There's little tiny blips here for some additional small shortages. Okay, are you ready? Okay, so right now, this is what the future looks like with the ECHO set, the proxy data set for the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. Again, using 2040 build-out condition. So you'll see immediately a lot more frequent shortages, and when we look at that 10% criteria, many, many years in excess, well in excess of 10%, as high as 30, 35, and almost approaching 40% shortfall. So we are not meeting our criteria in this future scenario. We are not able to keep it below 10% shortfall, nor are we able to come anywhere near the frequency. We see greater than 10% roughly once every 8 years. We see a single critical year shortfall of over 35%, and we've got some level of shortage every 5 years on the long-term average. This is not good. And this is why we're here to discuss tonight how we plan to address this. Okay. This is with the Urban Water Management Plan demands, and as I mentioned, we're modifying the demands moving forward, assuming the 5% conservation enabled through AMI. A lot of hard work by these young people over here. And with that benefit, we still see that we're in violation of our criteria, but you'll notice there's fewer shortages and these peaks are a lot shorter. We are still well in excess of 10% shortfall, and we have a frequency greater than 10%, so our critical years, most critical, once in 16 years, so about double the frequency of what our board-adopted policy is. We still have a single critical year of 25% shortfall, and we have some level of shortages basically every decade. So AMI, enhanced conservation, makes a big difference from the last data set, but it's still keeping us nowhere near meeting our existing board policy.
So Thomas, I just want to point out in the memo that Director Lee furnished,
Which I haven't read.
yeah, that's fine, so I will paraphrase, but he is very skeptical that AMI will provide the 5% conservation. Just wanted to make sure the board is aware of that. He also indicated that another director may be skeptical. I would suggest that certainly AMI will allow the district to better manage droughts. So even if you might not fully buy into the 5%, when you're in drought conditions, having all of that data available will definitely help us manage demand a lot more effectively, in my opinion. So I just wanted to throw that out, both to make sure that Director Lee's concern was heard, as well as to kind of provide a little bit of additional context.
Yeah, I would like to actually address one little element of that. So the board has heard our assumption of 5% is based on the pilot study done by East Bay Mud. They actually observed a 7% benefit. I would certainly say, and we haven't mentioned tonight that this year we're going to begin the update of our next demand forecast. Our demands are currently low and they've continued to stay low. In fact, we were expecting them to be higher this summer than last year, and so far they're lower. So our demand forecast is going to be revised. But what we may be seeing today is we may be seeing a lot of conservation happening now, and that's not going to be rebounding, and that may erode that future potential. I would certainly say that's a credible assumption. But it also means the start point is much lower. So it may simply be that this 5% that we assume will come with time, we may already be seeing, we may see that demand hardening, and AMI might not provide quite as much benefit. So I would say it's certainly it's a valid question, but we'll be getting to that this year through the WEMP study when we do the demand forecasting, and part of the survey that Community Affairs and Conservation are putting together with the Water Efficiency Master Plan. We'll be asking folks about their usage patterns, what's changed, what hasn't changed, and get to the basis of some of what we're seeing with demands today. So that's actually not a bad addition to the discussion right there. I did want to maybe point out one thing. As the general manager just pointed out, hey, if demands are lower, these shortfalls are lower. The real big effect here, when we look at the previous scenario, is that in this scenario we see semi-tropic run completely out of water. So if we get an extra 2,500 acre-feet of demand reduction, that's 2,500 acre-feet of available water supply in wet years and normal years that we can send to semi-tropic. So Devin Becker over here, I think everybody's met, is actually doing some pretty good modeling right now, and in the fall we're actually going to be bringing some of that analysis forward, looking at a little bit more detail and what we can do to mitigate some of these things. But these peaks shaved off are not so much because of the AMI in that single year, but the avoided water consumption in the years prior and the enhancements that has for the semi-tropic bank. It's a pretty complicated thing, actually. This is relevant. We asked that we have a handout for the board of these charts. One chart showing all of these scenarios on it to keep for your reference. Could we, Devin, do you think we could hand that out?
Yes.
And maybe while he hands that out, I'll run through a slide, but then we'll step back if you have questions about this chart.
Thomas, I know you're looking at that period from 1922 up to 2003, but why have you not included where we would have been with the recent record?
The current data set from the state runs through 2003. Now this year they're going to provide an updated data set that will come through 2015, and by the end of this calendar year we will be able to extend through and including the current drought. I think you may have stepped out when you were discussing this. So in a few months we actually will have through the most recent drought.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which will be a nice addition. And it improves the statistics and the viability of our analyses by having more years captured. It's a good question. Thank you. So while those are being handed out, I just want to point out what we learned from this business case for WaterFix over the past few years is that if we want to maintain our current level of service at 90%, we would likely have to invest in multiple projects. We're looking at WaterFix, we're looking at Los Vaqueros, we're looking at indirect potable reuse. At the time, AMI was a variable. Each one of those projects is $100 to $150 million. And what we saw is, hey, if you want to keep that level, we're going to need not one but multiple projects. We did observe that if we wanted to reduce our level of service to an 80%, that might be achievable through some combination of reoperation of our system plus maybe as few as one project, possibly none if we can get really creative. By reoperation, well, I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But one way or the other, we should expect that our frequency, the recurrence interval for which we're going to have a shortfall, is going to go up. There's going to be less water available for us in either scenario. Would anybody like to ask questions about the charts we just looked at? No? Okay. Are you all with me still? Okay.
I do have just one comment on the level of service, just from memory. Back in '95, having a 90% level of service was a novel, new idea. It was the first time that the water industry started realizing that guaranteeing 100% level of service 100% of the time is arguably irresponsible, because your ratepayers would be paying for facilities that they would really potentially only benefit from once every 30 years. So as part of that planning, conservation was built in as the new element sort of during droughts. That 90% level of service means your customers are going to conserve 10%. And just an additional element is, in the recent drought, ACWD asked our customers In fact, you could argue we were required to ask our customers to conserve.
I'm not arguing.
20%.
We were required.
And it was a state mandate. So this is the first time, basically what happened was the state of California stepped in and said, you know what, maybe you've invested in this water supply reliability, but guess what? We're not going to let you take advantage of it. You're going to have to conserve because we can't tolerate communities basically running out of water while other communities are enjoying a very reliable water supply. That was part of the narrative. So this isn't crazy talk right now. This is what we just experienced in the last drought.
Okay. So, excellent point. I think we're going to hit on some of these right now. So as I mentioned, Devin's been doing some great analysis in his spare time the past few weeks. There's not enough of that, unfortunately, to see what it might take to make the 90% level of service goal. And we're going to bring some of that analyses in the fall, and that'll be supported, hopefully, by new data from DWR, that new delivery capability, including through 2015. We'll be looking at things like reoperation. That means things like, right now we look at San Francisco as a variable cost, right? We can minimize that. In the future, we're looking even in a wet year when there's plentiful water from the state, maybe having to buy that extra 7,000 acre feet, extra $14 million a year, even in a wet year, just so we can park water down in semi-tropic. Heavy enhancements in conservation. The Water Efficiency Master Plan will be giving us some new information. Hopefully we can identify what the real potential is and see what the cost-effective investment there. Devin's identified a potential opportunity to enhance off-site banking. That might be a new value with LVE. Might be a bigger participation. Maybe a new contract with the groundwater bank somewhere. Looking at options about potentially buying wet year water, something we don't do now, taking advantage of those opportunities and topping off our storage. Reevaluating other IRP objectives, criteria, and elements. We're going to bring this in October. This is going to be probably the meatiest part of the October workshop. Spoiler alert. And then we're continuing, as always, to evaluate the water supply initiatives in front of us. Los Vaqueros, calling it conveyance, water fix, whatever we want to call it. Indirect potable reuse.
Thomas, I think I brought this up once before when Director Weed was not here attending that particular meeting, but I really would like to see us at least have it on the review board of reoperation of Lake Del Valle.
Okay. Noted. Noted. So there's a few other considerations when we talk about our level of service. As the general manager just pointed out, in 2014, we had a governor's order mandating a 20% cutback. Now, we were in a bit of a crisis, in 2014 because of the 0% allocation, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But the governor's order for 20% dovetailed with ours in 2014. That was fine. Worked well with what we needed to achieve. It wasn't any skin off our nose. But what we found in 2015 and 2016, as we came out of that critical part of the drought, things were still awfully dry throughout the state. But with our existing investments in our semi-tropic bank and the capability of the state, is we could have provided 100% level of pre-drought service in 15 and 16, but we're still mandated to keep a 20% reduction. So this is that stranded asset concept here. Our customers had spent hundreds of millions of dollars over the past decades to invest in reliability that we were not allowed to take advantage of. Another consideration is that as the drought advanced into 2016, there was so much public messaging out there and perhaps public sentiment about the responsibility of efficiency of water use that our customers had voluntarily hit a 27% reduction from pre-drought levels. So mind you, we're working to maintain 90% reliability, 90% level of service, excuse me, but our customers were taking matters into their own hands. And then one last interesting thing is when we look around the Bay today, ACWD currently has the highest level of service goal amongst our sister agencies. In fact, several other agencies have in the past few years reduced their level of service goals. I might note that those agencies had a person who's now here. I don't know if there's a pattern or a cause and effect there. But you'll see Zone 7 and Valley Water both in recent years. Zone 7 had the most ambitious goal of 100%. There's a lot of politics behind that. I think most people know that story. They had to reduce to an 85%. I believe they're discussing going even lower. And Valley Water recently reduced from 90% to 80%. So today, on the books, ACWD has the highest level of service goal amongst the neighboring agencies.
You know, Thomas, I would also add to this list, and I would couch this, I'd like to get your feedback, but I think that the South Bay Aqueduct belongs on this list too. You can't provide level of service meeting your reliability targets if we have a system that's not working. So there's an investment required in the South Bay Aqueduct if we want to meet a reliability target over the long term. And we know the condition of the South Bay Aqueduct today.
Okay, to be clear, are we talking about not working because of an emergency, or that you're suggesting it's not capable of delivering capacity because of its age status?
Age, repairs that are needed, disruption due to an earthquake,
Okay.
anything that can happen in that 30-year window.
Certainly.
And we were just talking at the last board meeting about USGS forecasting a 6.7 or 7.0 earthquake between now and 2040 or 2042.
So you're speaking towards the resiliency topic that we said we should add in. So, and I'd like to point out you wanted to pass initially and then you added a yes, so yes, we are including that in there. We're talking about reliability to deliver the water. There's no indication that the South Bay Aqueduct cannot, apart from a disruption such as an earthquake, be counted on to deliver our existing Table A. Studies are underway, there's improvement plans in place. So the South Bay Aqueduct is old, but it has a maintenance plan associated with it, and there's some detailed studies going on now. The earthquake outage, definitely agreed that falls into that resiliency bucket, but that's that other category we talked about earlier. So I would suggest resiliency, yes. Whether or not the South Bay Aqueduct can't deliver supply in the future, it's not really I don't think that's a terribly credible concern for us in reliability. We're not going to see, for example, the I'd say like a third world country, let's say, where deferred maintenance reduces the capacity to 50% and nobody does anything about it. I don't think that's a reasonable future for the South Bay Aqueduct, if that's what we're proposing. I mean, if so, we could apply that to all the other infrastructure as well.
Well, I'll just ask the question. I'm not trying to argue a point here. I just want to throw it out as a question. In my mind, I say to myself, the first investments that the district should make are on hardening the system that we have right now. If we want to maintain reliability over the long term, and that would include the South Bay Aqueduct, as well as the other seismic improvements we're making.
Noted.
Thank you. You know, go back to the 20% the state mandated. I can envision that happening again easily. I mean, they're already doing that effectively, long term.
There's some arguments that it was one governor's action, but it is a precedent. As the general manager noted, it's the first time in history. And once you have a precedent, it's very easy to take the same action again in the future.
I mean, but they're already kind of pushing that anyway with 2020.
Through the conservation legislation.
Conservation legislation.
Correct.
So, I mean, we could harden up our demand level to 100%, but can't hit it.
Our reliability.
Our reliability,
our level of
100%,
service.
but the state comes in and says it's going to be 20% less. What's the use? And I think that maybe we need to factor that into the modeling, which I think you're already doing.
It's a factor that we're considering. It's one of those new pieces of information that we have as a result of the drought. And, you're going to talk about some other things we learned during the drought and deal with that too. But since we are talking about the level of service issue, whether it's 90% or 80%, whatever, I should just also remind the board that the ECHO said is currently the worst case scenario. It's possible that that worst case doesn't happen. And, in the past, our planning has been flexible to deal with that kind of stuff. That's why we don't have recycled water today. That said, running out of water is not an option. That can happen. So, we plan for the worst and hope for better when it comes to water supply.
So, Thomas, here's just a bit of a concern. I think our customers stepped up and we did conserve 27%. And it is also almost the fact that in the future will be requested or required to ask our customers to conserve. But realistically speaking, most of our customers have changed their fixtures, they have conserved their hard goods that's in place, the drought-tolerant gardens, where they already do their best and there isn't that much more they could do to conserve. So where is this 20% going to come from?
It's a great question. Yeah, demand hardening is what we're talking about. People have done everything they have. Now you're starting to talk about public health and safety if you're reducing it.
Right. So putting aside the state mandate that we have to follow, we'll have no choice but to follow what's required in conservation. Putting yourself in our customer's point of view. If there is no way I could conserve another 20%, what are my options? There really isn't much. Then this is back to what do we tell our customers, right? Because literally we'll have 20% less water to deliver to be spread out.
Correct.
You could say maybe we get very lucky that there are other people who could still conserve, and it will kind of average out somehow, right?
Yeah.
But that is kind of not that realistic if you look at the age of the houses in our area. Most of the older houses have been updated. The newer housing that we've been putting in is ultra high efficiency. Where is this water going to come from?
I'm assuming that's a rhetorical question.
Well, actually, that is kind of a, we could do our planning, we could say, yes, there will be 20% of mandated conservation, and that's why ACWD should not be investing in all these infrastructure. I guess what I'm requesting is, when you're going through this whole entire scenario, also look at how much it will cost for us to go back to our 90% reliability. Right, at some point, you'll be a cost-benefit analysis, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Spoiler alert, this chart here, if I'm directed to continue to work with the assumption that we must meet a 90%,
Right.
we can't do it unless you're spending upwards of $500 million in investment.
Okay, those are the numbers that I need, right?
Right.
What are we talking about in
Yeah.
terms of meters?
Those are the numbers you'll see as we go further into the process. I want to point out, to answer your question though, we're looking at the pre-AMI assumption. When we talk about a 35%, we've analyzed these things. This is part of our water shortage emergency plan. It's published in UWMP. This one right here is absolutely zero outdoor water use. All landscaping dead. I don't care if you got ornamental trees, established root trees, zero water. That's what this is right here. There's always going to be a little bit of water in leaks. Stephanie, what percent of brand new houses are going to have a leaky toilet? It's got to be a certain percent.
Yeah, I know.
There's always, that's what AMI is going to help with. There's, you have a flapper valve within a few years, it's going to be leaking, and that's where AMI is going to help. Those are small pieces of fruit, and they're high on the tree. We have hit that low-hanging fruit. It's a great question. And we'll have a better sense with the new forecasting and the WEMP study as to what that potential will be, but it's key to the question right there.
What fraction of the water use is residential compared to the rest?
We're about 70% residential.
Because I noticed a lot
I
of
think it changed
really
recently.
green
Sorry, actually.
commercial real estate around.
I'm sorry?
I've noticed a lot of really green commercial real estate around.
Green landscaping?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not
High water.
green in the modern eco sense.
No, high water.
High water. Yeah, we do have a number of programs. Those sorts of landscapes actually have water budgets, and we give them budgets every year to let them know whether they're above or below that usage. And on balance, they're actually all more or less in the zone of efficient level of use for their landscaping. But there's a lot of conversion of turf into drought-tolerant landscaping that uses less water. We actually rebate a fair amount of that. So that is one area for enhanced conservation moving forward, is to get that turf out and put in native plants. I'm going to ask Shireen, because I recently gave you those numbers. Do you remember if our split has changed?
I believe about 30%.
It's still about 70% residential. And that 30% is commercial, industrial, and institutional, governments, churches, things like that as well. I think there was another question coming from the board. Okay. So, where were we? So we move on. You guys are doing great. Stuff gets more fun after this, trust me. But I'll get out of here. Another consideration about our level of service goal. So in 2014, we had an unprecedented condition where we got a 0% allocation for a period of 6 months, which eventually bumped up to 5%. But the point is that when this board wisely took action in February of 2014, we had no indication that we were going to get anything at all. 0% was what we were given. There was no indication of improvement, and in fact, the state was looking at losing the delta, meaning the delta could potentially be overwhelmed by salt from the bay and become unable to deliver potable water. DWR, in hindsight, says, that should have been a 10% allocation year, which is as bad as in 1977 or 1924. But acknowledged that they had some mismanagement in 2013 that they didn't really get on top of, and then they went into the most unprecedented dry period after that. Remember, we had no rain for, I don't know, it was like 80 years. No, it was 9 months, I think. It's insanely dry period in California as a measured history. So that, on top of a little bit of a management snafu in the previous year, led to that 0% scenario. We were forced to do a 20% shortage emergency, and we actually had in our planning supply, that's basically what we call the delta outage scenario, what we would do if we had lost the delta from an earthquake. That was our 20% ordinance. Stephanie was deeply involved with that. We pretty much dusted off our plan, put a little bit more flesh on the bones, and rolled out a water shortage ordinance that our customers actually adhered to very nicely. We were right on the number. Well done. But the question is 2014 a real scenario, and do we want to maintain a 90% level of service? So if we consider 2014 to be a regular recurrence, and we want to maintain a 90% level of service, those two assumptions right there are going to dictate specific investments that this district must make. Director Sethy.
Thomas, I would just like to mention, especially since we have a guest here tonight, we have a lot of new people in the room here. Things were so dire in the Delta in 2014 that the state actually had to build a barrier in the Delta to prevent ocean water, seawater, from penetrating south into the Delta. And that took a lot of very quick work on an enormous project to prevent the flow of seawater down south. Otherwise, we literally would have lost the entire transportation of water to the South Bay and to Silicon Valley. It was that dire.
It was that dire. It was done in 1977 as well. And yeah, those are the extreme measures that were taken. That's a good recollection, good recall. So the point on this position here is that if we want to consider 2014 to be a real recurrent year and maintain a 90% level of service, that will dictate specific actions by this district. And so what staff is recommending at this point is that we consider 2014 to really be an anomaly, an emergency year, a true emergency year that falls outside of our reliability planning, but to have been a true water supply emergency that is not what we planned for with our level of service goal. That falls under that resiliency category. And we were fortunate in our alternative supplies that we were able to still meet 80% level of service. I think we'll hit this for board feedback on the next slide, which is staff recommendations. Are there any questions about what happened in 2014 with DWR? The point here is, and it's already making my stomach turn just a little bit, because when that new delivery capability report comes out, they're probably going to show that 2014 was a 10% allocation year. That's all the indication right now, which we all know, because of some other reality factors, wasn't 10%. And do we want to read more into that, or do we want to just assume that it was a anomalous emergency?
I'm chuckling a little bit about your wording on due to a combination of management decisions.
Not district management, to be perfectly clear.
You could apply some of the blame to the board, too.
Water management decisions made by the state of California. How about that? So, I think we're ready to transition out of the level of service discussion with the summary of staff recommendations. The board can't change its policy like this here tonight, but basically what we are asking for is direction from the board. Are you adamant that we must maintain 90%, or can we consider moving towards a lower level of service when we head towards the 2025 Water Supply Master Plan? As pointed out here, this is going to involve public input. This will not be a unilateral decision made by the board. That will be a 2-year process with several public stakeholder work groups. But are we open to that consideration? And with that, can you give staff direction to bring to you, when we do our supply planning analyses, consideration of a 90% and an 80% level of service to better inform the board and see the trade-off providing that higher level of service and then the slightly lower level of service? So I want to pause here and get feedback. Is there anyone on this board, sorry, that sounds too direct.
Should we turn the lights off and hold up matches or something?
How about I'll just make it easier? I'm fine with considering both scenarios.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to offer an opinion?
I would concur with what Director Huang said right now. I would consider both. I'd like to see what the trade-offs are. But I have a higher level question that comes to mind. How does this impact our mission statement?
Well, it's a good question. Our mission is to provide a highly reliable, high-quality supply of water at a reasonable cost. Now, if we talk about the trade-off of reliability, quality, and cost, there's going to be a trade-off.
Yeah, and what is the public perception of high reliability?
Actually, I think the mission is actually provide a reliable supply of high-quality drinking water to our customers at a reasonable cost. So, it's a reliable supply, and how you define that is what we're talking about.
The board in 1995 decided what that meant, and we're trying to say that it's time to take another look at what defines reliable.
Well,
given what we learned in the drought, given what the region is doing.
I'm asking a deeper question, and maybe we can learn from the experience of other districts what the public reaction was. You know, like when you reduce down to 80%. What's the public perception? Is it that we're only going to have water 80% of the time, year to year? What does the water district definition mean to the public?
Good question for our community affairs people to look into in the future. We have requested information. I don't know, Kurt, if you have any insight or wisdom, having been involved with both agencies that recently went through a reduction in levels. Do you have anything to share? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I think the only difference is being a wholesaler, right? It was really working with the retailers, and cost was a big driver, rates. Right. They're looking at rates that they're going to be charged. So it's a little different dynamics with those discussions.
And they get to blame the wholesaler
if
the public complains later about the reliability.
But I think that's the $60 million question.
No, $300 to $500 million.
This billion-dollar question in that, we could have that high reliability, but is the public going to be willing to pay for it? I think that's really the wild. I've always, I don't know. I don't think that 0% is unheard of from the State Water Project. Never did. We water banked with semi-tropic, but back then I remember it was like, yeah, it could happen. And anything's possible. But as Thomas pointed out earlier, in that, that 80, 90%, I think it's good to have both numbers because now we're starting to talk cost. Back in 95, too old to remember any of that stuff. But, we didn't have hardly any of the stresses we have today. I mean, steelhead, that was something you had for dinner. Semi-tropic, looking at it, water banking, we were out front on that. Delta smell was bait.
To catch steelhead?
Yeah. So, there were things that the stressors that are out there, and climate change, like you said, climate change, it's a matter of turning on the air conditioner. Do I need to buy an air conditioner for my bedroom? So, these things have changed dramatically since 95. And I do think economically it's important for us to put the 80% in there. Because I wish I had more faith in the public, but I don't.
I'll leave now.
Well, no, it's faithful. We have a member of the public here, But to be honest, how many people are going to watch this tape tonight? Next week or 2 weeks from now. And so we have to make these decisions for them in our best interest, but we also, I think, have to look at what is the economics. We already know that when we increased our rates, 20%, is significant. We kind of packed the boardroom, and it was not a happy crowd. The last rate increase of 4% was not necessarily a happy crowd. It was certainly much smaller, but it was still there. So I don't know. I think it's going to be our messaging to say, hey, yeah, if people get upset over the 90%, it's, well, yeah, sure, we can make it 90%. We can make it 100%. Of course, the state will come in and say you're going to be 80%, but we can make it 100%, but are you willing to have a service charge of triple what you're paying now? Because that's where it's going to go. It's going to go on the service charge, because that's a reliability issue. Are you going to have that? We're already looking at that with the Delta conveyance. And we made that choice and said, yes, economically and reliability-wise, we needed to do that. And I'm very concerned about the Delta and where we're going with the environmental issues. We are not in control. Once again, we have to react. I think we've reacted very well to the Delta or to the Alameda Creek situation. 95. We didn't figure on that. It only took us 20 years plus to build the stupid fish ladders. I only call it stupid because why should it take 20 years to build a fish ladder? Of course, it was our benefit. We got plenty of grant money because of it. So I think the 80%, 90% is more of an economic term to have in our plan and approach it from that point. Is, yeah, we can do 80%, we can do 90%, we've been doing 90%, but guess what, folks? Things have changed. And in order to get 90% today, with all these additional stressors, it's going to be this much more on your service charge. And you can't You can't save yourself out of the service charge.
Thomas?
Can I take you down as a yes, let's look at 80 and 90? I don't want to
I suppose
put words in your
I
mouth.
guess you could.
Okay, thank you. Director Sethy, you were about to ask a question.
If you have a question, I
No, I
actually...
just want to clarify what I was saying about public perception when we're talking about 80 or 90% level of service. I think the public perception is we have 100% reliability right now, and that no matter what time of day you turn on your water, it's there, right?
Yeah.
But as we're trying to address this and we're trying to do public outreach, we have to remember a lot of people in our community have arrived here from countries where the water's only on 6 hours a day. That's their perception of reality. Or it's on half a day, or it's on 4 hours in the morning in many parts of India and 4 hours in the afternoon, evening time, right?
You got to fill up the bathtub when you
Right,
can.
and so they're, in their mind, they're getting maybe 8 hours of service a day. That's, 30% reliability on the water system. What does it mean to have an 80% level of service? Does that mean my water's going to be shut off from time to time? Is it a day-to-day thing, a month-to-month thing? Is it annual? The water district definition of level of service is different than what I think a customer has in mind when they hear the same language.
Sure. Good point. We're messaging, and when we do public outreach, come 2023, 20 through 25, definitely make sure that the professionals like our community affairs folks and whomever's working on that
Right,
project.
I don't want people coming down to the boardroom and screaming, you mean my water's going to be shut off?
We can hand out jerry cans to people to...
20% is 5 hours out of the day.
In the context of the way we're discussing it, the question at the end that we'll pose to a customer is,
During a drought,
during the drought, well, basically, we're asking them, once in 30, are you willing to do 10% conservation once in every 30 years? Or if I say we will save $300, $500 million, which translates to X amount of dollar on your charges per month, are you willing to live with 20% conservation every 30 years? That basically is the bottom line in the context we're talking about, right? It is not shutting off your water certain days. It is once in 30 years, we'll be coming to you saying, can you conserve 20%?
Or once in 16.
Or once in however many a years that we decide. Once in X number of year, are you willing to do Y% of conservation,
Correct.
which will equal X amount of dollars?
Yeah, and
I
That
would
be our
suggest
message.
we nuance the messaging
And I
when
think
we get to
Director
that
Sethy-
actual decision discussion.
Right, so that's how I view it.
Correct.
Since we're talking about messaging. We will get to that point once we
Once we get there.
get there.
I think Director Sethy's message is right on in that perception. The funny thing is, I've said it before, reliability is number one. The Coast Guard does not have enough water on its ships. And when you're one of the engineers in charge of the water, you know that very well. To have a valve get stuck on a laundry machine is critical. And so, no, I'm a firm believer in, you turn the tap on, the water is there. And that's, I think, we have the message. We're not talking about 80% not having the ability to turn a tap on and have the water there. We're not going there.
Okay.
I'll spend the money to not go there.
I'd like to just point out, I think, well, this is messaging, it's future, it's great input, but I think we're all on the same page on this, and maybe if we could come back to the core
I
topic.
think we could move on, but I
Yes.
will just say, you heard the concern because this meeting is being recorded.
Correct.
We do not want to give the perception to our customer at this point of time that we're actually debating about shutting
Water off at high
Okay.
frequencies.
That is totally
for-
not the discussion we're talking about, potentially ask for 10% conservation and 20% conservation. With that, let's move on.
Okay. Director Akbari, you've been trying to get a comment.
I
didn't you?
don't
Yeah.
really have any more comments. I think everyone kind of covered it, but I just want to make sure that I'm also on board.
You're in agreement as well?
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, great. And then the last item, of course, as we said we would staff recommendation at this time, at least until the state gives us more data about 2014, that we consider 2014 to be an anomaly. It's outside, it's a once in a 90-year scenario. It's outside of what we're talking about with reliability, at least for now until we have more guidance from the state. Okay. With that, we're ready to transition to discussion of a key element from the IRP. We are well past time. Question is it necessary to take a break? We're going to have a little activity coming up. I can certainly go quickly through the preamble slides to get into the next section. But
I'd like a 5-minute break if we can, please.
6:25. So I bring it back to the one bell. Start back up, bring it to one bell.
just some nautical things.
Yeah, that was it. Engine show. Okay. Starting the engines back up.
All right. Great. So we're all ready to proceed. This will get a little bit more fun. We're asked a little bit of board interaction here. It's not as technical. And
A little bit more fun?
Well, we're having so much fun already. You can only do a
I
little.
know.
Yeah, how much fun are we going to get?
Yeah, it's kind of like fun-hardening. Just like you achieve this level of fun, it's hard to get more fun.
It's like too much Christmas. Huh? So our next section, we want to talk about when we talk about objectives, criteria, and strategy elements, we want to talk about a specific strategy element from the IRP, which is conservation. And why we're bringing it tonight, it's quite topical. One is it directly hits level of service. The second is that we're in the middle of the Water Efficiency Master Plan, and actually we're going to get input tonight to feed into that plan so that we can have a more streamlined process to bring feedback to the board from that analysis and then help shape the future of ACWD's water conservation program. So it's a great opportunity. With that, I want to just give a quick background. So conservation was a program. Our program was originally based on the 1995 IRP, which made a recommendation for specifically Package 2. They looked at a bunch of different packages of conservation offerings. That was heavily focused on, well, actually, let me just pause here. I think the general manager mentioned it. In 1995, it was borderline a little crazy to put in your supply strategy to spend money to give to people so that they would use less water. That was very progressive thinking in the 90s, and it was spurned by the 1987 to 1992 drought. But ACWD was very much a progressive agency at that time in its IRP, and this being one key part of that. So I don't want to lose sight of that. It's an important fact. Our package from the IRP had a heavy focus on reducing outdoor use, because what that does is it reduces our peak month demand, and what that does is it reduces our need for capacity, treatment capacity, import capacity. It keeps costs lower, and it also aided in meeting our ability to meet our hardness goals at the blending facility. So having more treatment at other facilities plus reducing demand allowed the blender to meet the 150 ppm. But conservation is a very dynamic field, and in our program has expanded and gone in all kinds of different directions than what was originally conceived of in 1995. So to talk just a little bit about that so we understand where we're all on the same page, Stephanie Nevin, you can come back up and discuss our current program.
So I think you're all aware that this is one of my favorite topics. Just to remind you, our conservation program, we have about 30 programs. Right now, I think there's about 26 that are active, but we're going to have another one coming active, hopefully, coming up pretty soon. So it kind of changes from year to year, but it's around 30 programs. Also, we provide customer service. We support customer service and answering questions for customers that have high bills, helping them reduce their use and identify their issues if it's something that conservation can help with. And we do outreach, and we also do regional coordination. So we have something for every customer, and our programs are a variety of incentives, technical support, and education. So I'm going to go through these really quickly, because everybody's been here for a long time, but this is the list of our conservation programs. As you can see, for the residential customers, we offer a variety of rebates. This turf removal is going to come to the board for approval to restart that program. We ended it because DWR had started their own program. So that's going to come next month. And then we give away shower heads and low flow faucet aerators. We have a gardening tool. Also rebates for commercial, industrial, and institutional customers. Similar rebates, some different ones. For large landscape customers, we offer also different types of rebates, smart controllers, turf removal. We also provide them water budgets where we compare their actual use to what we think they should be using based on their landscape area measurements and the weather data that we have. And we will give them an award if they're doing really well with that. And we also do some surveys of large landscape sites to provide some information about how they could manage the equipment at the site or their schedule better to be more efficient. Then we do this for all our customers. We provide workshops. We have the demonstration garden. We give conservation materials out. We attend a lot of events. You've heard about those recently. And we also update a section on the website, and so we're pretty active. So now I'm going to hand it back over to Mr. Neiser.
Stop calling me that.
That is an official board meeting.
Thanks.
Did anybody have any questions about the program? Okay.
Great. So, bringing it back to what does water resources do in the planning context? We heard from the conservation person, from the matrix of water supply planning, what has it done for us? As I mentioned in 1995, it was kind of seen as being out there. It was actually rated very low points under risk. It was deemed a high-risk measure. You're spending money to get people to change their behavior. There was no confidence that that could be done. So it was actually considered a high-risk investment. But we know today it's a proven success story. In the 2014 IRP review document, the glossy that we have, we published some of these figures, but it's helpful to bring them back up. We know from our original 1995 plan, we had a range to achieve by 2030 upwards of about 5,000 acre-feet. In 2014, we measured, this is before the drought, 3,600 acre-feet, so well on pace. So that number on that high end, we were right on schedule. We also saw in 1995 a projected unit cost escalated to 2019 dollars, so today's dollars, about $700 an acre-foot to achieve that savings. In 2014, we estimated all-in salaries, rebates, everything we've ever spent on conservation with ongoing savings, $463 an acre-foot. Unless, Stephanie, how much have we received in grants?
So we've received about $2 million since 2001 for conservation programs.
What is?
So it's about 20% of our operating costs for the conservation.
Right, so 80% of this number. So right on schedule and actually at lower expense than anticipated. We also, through our production modeling, we just went ahead and ran through, well, hey, what if we had all that demand? We saw in 2014 that our ongoing savings is $1.2 million per year in reduced operating costs because of this level of conservation. It's also delayed construction of a recycled water project. As mentioned, by 2020, we were supposed to have a non-potable supply and a non-potable system, $100 to $150 million. That's an investment in technology, which if you read our board meetings from, I think, last month, you'll see that we are thinking the technology and the times have changed, and some of us feel it's a good thing we haven't done that. But one of the most important things that I'd like to point out is that we have seen our water supply drop off consistently since 1995. We've had multiple biological opinions. We've given up water on Alameda Creek to provide fisheries restoration. And if we look at the drop and the decline in our average water supply, and if we consider what's happening with ECHO, and we look at our old forecast, we would see that, today, we would be on the verge of having normal year shortfall, insufficiency of supply. So conservation has kept us from having to develop not just recycled water, but an additional potable supply. So And, well, I would like to step back one point. When we say $1.2 million per year savings in production costs, we're not spending anywhere close to $1 million on our conservation program per year. Conservation is actually making the district money. We're saving more than we're investing in at this point. So, with that, another thing we've seen since 1995, in that time it was, hey, here's an alternative to developing a new supply. But what's happened over the past 30 years is California politics and that public sentiment change has been so dramatic that conservation is serving many different roles for the district today. Notably, as Stephanie mentioned, we're doing a fair amount of community outreach to the conservation program, the public LEAF program and Earth Day events, Earth Days, some of the other ones, Tesla. So the number of community outreach events that conservation is supporting, providing additional customer service. But really since 2009 with the passage of SB X7X, conservation is now a regulatory compliance. We had the SB 7, we had the drought mandates, and now we've got making conservation in California way of life. All of that extra pressure on the conservation program has really ramped up during the drought. For the past 5 years, this program has been 65% reliant on temporary staffing. And frankly, it's at a not sustainable rate. Okay, we can't keep doing this. We're sort of performing at this level with this much staff and there's this much demand. And so what we want to do tonight is, through the WET process, we're going to be refocusing conservation, but we want to get some feedback from the board tonight on just what it does and doesn't want to see kind of moving forward with conservation. We want to kind of check on how things are going now and get some input and some prioritization for conservation programming moving into the future. So basically, we require direction so that objectives can be refined and staff can be focused and efficient in the implementation of its conservation program. The WEMP will address that. AMI is a current pressure on staff as well, but conservation is going to be enhanced through AMI, and that's going to have further direction for conservation staff to implement the AMI program. How we use that information and the expectations of our customers with all that new data. So, Ms. Heides.
Thank you very much. So, kind of have a quick pause between Thomas has just brought you through, or brought all of us through sort of 1995 to now, what we've been doing with conservation. As you can see, it's been a busy time, but now we're going to be kind of transitioning to the Water Efficiency Master Plan and where we're going to look at moving all of this forward. So we wanted to just take a quick moment to do a bit of a temperature check with the board and kind of get your feelings on kind of where we are now, kind of are we doing about what's right, level of conservation, or are people interested in thinking as we're looking toward the Water Efficiency Master Plan and what different types of packages we might put together? Do we want to turn up the heat possibly with more programming, or is it kind of like we've done a lot of stuff, we've got 30 different programs, it seems like too much. So we kind of wanted to see if you guys had a gut reaction, sort of where you're at with the temperature on conservation, and or any other feedback currently you wanted to share before we launch into talking a little bit more about the Water Efficiency Master Plan and some of the different things we're going to think about.
Let me ask a question that I think might be helpful for all of us. Of the 30 programs you have right now, I'm aware of some that are kind of being phased out already right now. How many of those over the next year or two are just disappearing by attrition of the program no longer being, worthwhile?
Right, and I think Stephanie can speak to the details. I don't think we've had a whole lot that we've sunset, and right now we're kind of holding steady until we do this new Water Efficiency Master Planning effort, but maybe you can speak to what's been...
But aren't we sunsetting some where we've achieved a level of penetration in the community with certain appliances?
Yeah, so the closed washer rebate program was the big one that we ended because we felt like we had really, we did like over 30,000 washer rebates. And
step to the side.
Oh, thanks. Sorry.
You have a big C on your face.
Yeah, so that one we ended because that was, we had a partner in that was ending it, and so that was part of it. PG&E was our partner. It was a regional effort, and everybody was kind of feeling like that had lived its life, and it was no longer necessary to get these washes out there. We had transformed the market, And, anything you buy now is pretty efficient. So that was part of it. But that was a big one. There were also a couple other little programs that were just didn't make sense anymore. We didn't either have a lot of participation in them, or we had a limited time for it anyway because of funding for the program. But the conservation program is dynamic, so there's all this new technology, innovation, changes in what other water districts are doing. And so we're kind of watching what's happening outside, what makes sense, and just trying to keep track of that and making any change that we think, like ending one program but starting another one if we see that there's an opportunity. So there is some phasing out, but also some potential phasing in of new programs.
Well, if you're asking for my feedback, I think that the previous slides are proving the point that we've heard a lot from the environmental community, that conservation is the lowest cost of saving water. And so if we need to provide more staffing in order to cover the programs that we have currently, I think that's maybe something we have to consider. But I would try to eliminate programs that you don't find are very efficient, and we don't have a list of them here today. Mm-hmm. But I would tell you that where I would put a priority, I would maintain the priority on on turf replacement. And number two, it appears as though we have a new rebate program coming up with BOSCA on the outdoor irrigation controllers. And while we're trying to slowly get to the indoor state mandates that we need to achieve over time, the biggest bang for the buck is in the outdoor usage of water. So I'd really like to see the water district rally behind that outdoor irrigation rebate program. And I'm just going to pick one small one, which is an example that I'd like to bring out. I brought it out before. When I go to Home Depot or Lowe's and I see the rain barrels that are there, and we have these great stories in the Tri-City Voice in your conservation column about rain barrels periodically. I saw one recently. I don't know when it was. But there's nothing for the consumer to see at the hardware stores where you buy the rain barrels. And, like you saw the tags that were on a washing machine when you went in, even to Fry's Electronics. You knew that you'd get a rebate from PG&E and the Water District, right? We need to see those kind of rebate cards right at point of sale on these products throughout our community, so that people know, oh, it's $100 to buy this, or $200 and I get a $50 rebate. And so I think we could do some community outreach to those retailers that sell those rain barrels. I'm just picking out one idea.
Could I just throw in a point? One thing that I think sorry to interrupt, regarding activity and sunsetting things, ongoing programs don't take a lot to run if there's not a lot of activity. So the sunsetting thing is kind of not a thing. This is a case of where we're always adding and not taking away, but programs that are not active are not a burden. So I just wanted to make that point. It's a burden to start a new program, but to maintain an ongoing program that nobody's interested in kind of has no cost or labor associated with it. So it's positively associated with how engaged the public is in the program.
Although there is a little bit, because you kind of have to keep some But definitely starting up a program is where most of the energy and time is goes.
Do we see some of the programs following kind of like the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the people who apply for rebate tend to go for like 20% of the rebates that we offer. And do we see any kind of trend in that direction?
See, I'm not sure if I understand. You said-
Hot programs, which
Are
one
there
program's
programs
hotter
that
than
are
another one?
far more
Oh.
popular and other programs that seem to be not popular at all?
Yeah, it changes all the time. In something like when the drought happened, there was so much media attention, especially on turf removal. That program went nuts. So it was a combination of things where people just started wanting to change out their landscaping, their lawn, and put in low water use landscaping. So, but there has to be kind of an external force going on that makes that happen. Otherwise, they're all kind of, I don't know, maybe Meg Sagan, do you want to say anything about this?
Yeah, I
Some
feel
ideas?
that's a great question. I think there are some programs that generate a lot more interest, but it's pretty steady. Like, since we offer a wide variety to all customer types, it kind of, like, it's pretty consistent, the amount of people applying to each program.
I mean, I feel pretty comfortable with the conservation programs that we have currently. It's one of the best ways that we interact with our community, and especially when we have tough conversations with members in our community about the cost of water. This is one of the biggest programs that I like to point them towards. That, if you are looking to be more conscious about your water usage, then we offer some great rebate programs. And so I'm quite happy with the program as it exists today. It's always easy to say, let's offer more things, but I think it also depends on staff's ability to carry out those programs effectively, and also what the appetite of the public is, because if they're not that interested in the program, there's no point in moving in that direction. Well, the reason I was asking my original question is, if there are programs that we feel are just not popular anymore, then I would be comfortable phasing those out, but also looking at other opportunities based on trends in the community or trends in media, and introducing new programs to take those spots. Also, I really agree with what Director Sethy said about having more insignias and partnering with local retailers for rain barrels, for instance, and making sure that customers know that if they do purchase one of these, they're eligible for a rebate.
So I'm going to start just by saying it's kind of hard to answer your question. I do agree with Director Sethy and Director Akbari that this is a great program, and I totally support conservation and that it is our cheapest source of water. But you're just not giving me enough information to answer your question, because what it boils down to is what's the cost benefit of each program? How much does it cost us to run, and how much water do we actually save? And what are the other opportunities out there? If you're telling me right now all programs are cost effective, and then there are these other bunch of great programs out there, if we have 2 more staff, we could save even more water, translate up to about $500 per acre foot, I would say, hey, put those 2 people in. So I don't quite have enough information to answer your question right now, because I don't know what's out there, because there are possibilities that it's worth us to do the additional investment in staff time, just because that would generate significant amounts of savings to the district, or not have to buy that additional water or treat that additional water. So, but in general, I like our conservation program, and I think it's a good idea.
I think we're at an interesting time in that it's not on the public's front door. I mean, the drought, it was. If you were to go out today trying to message conservation, I don't think you're going to get the same reaction. But that's a messaging thing. But as far as the program goes, we need to be careful in that we don't just, because that you're going to have to be able to throw that switch and have those programs ready, and we were ready when we got slammed with zero. I mean, I think as a district we were far ready because we had prepped for it. We already had things in place. Our ordinances would basically look just like the state's. And we were well ahead of them. But when that happens, next year, this year coming up, we don't know what it's going to do. And we need to be ready then, not 6 months later. So I don't know if it's a question of holding steady or more of a being ready. We've got a lot of good programs. I really do like Director Sethy's concept in that, maybe that's a way we can look while we're in these periods where it's not an issue, it's not headlines, that how can we make more of an impact? And it might be something as simple as maybe, and we might have to spend a little money there with the Home Depots and Lowe's, because that's all that's left. You got Dale still. But I don't think we can get through Amazon. Interesting to try to crack that. But still, that concept of the rain barrel there and having that little rebate, will it save us anything? If it gets us 6 people to buy them more, then maybe it's worth it initially. Once they buy it, it's in place and they're using it. But when you need to turn the switch on, you got to be able to turn the switch on and not have it 6 months later come on board. So I don't know if that helps. I mean, as far as staffing goes, I mean, Stephanie, you sleep, right? So, but no, I mean, it's once again, it's cost and economics, and I think the program is definitely good. So I'm not really saying hold steady, and I'm not sure I'm saying turn up the heat, but more of being in a position that we can turn it up. Maybe now's the time to see what's available, where we think we can make an impact.
Can I ask a question, clarification? When we say turn it up, you mean akin to what we did in 2014?
Yeah.
Did you find that sufficient for your definition of turn it up?
That was definitely, we had to turn it up. When the drought hit, zero. It was like, oh man, what are we going to do? And we were pushing hard. We had been pushing hard before that. I'm not saying we weren't, but everybody, the state pushed it up harder, and we were able to react. We didn't have to suddenly go into this emergency mode to get there. We were already there. We already knew how to do it.
So that's an example of what you mean by be ready.
To be ready. And
okay, so I would say it's effectively status quo then, the sort of what we're doing, that's what put us in that position.
Yeah, the status quo, we were doing well, and we put the effort in to be there. And if we're in a position now, or maybe now we could also look at what is available, maybe not necessarily jump on it yet, but what else is out there?
Goes back to Carpe Diem, seize the day when you have the chance.
That's my college motto, by the way. Class motto, not college.
Thank you. Another question.
It seems like some of the board members are jumping on this rain barrel issue. I went through the analysis, and I figured out that it would take 30 refills of my rain barrels just to break even. And given that all our water happens in a very short period, I couldn't use all the water when it's wet, and then when it's dry, I've got 9 months of empty barrels. So in some sense, it's going to take me like 10, 15 years to actually break even. And plus also the rebate, I could buy a garbage can for $10 compared to like, a $70 rain barrel where that breaking point would be much larger. So I'm saying, even at the cheapest way I could do it, it was still not very effective. And I don't think it would save the water company a lot of money in terms of water. On the other hand, I did it because I viewed this as a way to save extra water in case there's an earthquake, you keep water right. But that's just some feedback on the effectiveness of the program might be not what you expect.
It might mean we need to offer a better rebate sheet.
In fact, I got like $10, I could get these 55-gallon drums for $10, which was much cheaper than Home Depot.
That's the problem with living in a Mediterranean climate. If you lived on the East Coast, where you get frequent, recurring...
Where I grew up, I remember that it would be much more effective there.
Right.
And then you look at all the advertising, it shows like all East Coast homes.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all of you for being willing to share your thoughts, because this is really helpful to us as we jump into the Water Efficiency Master Plan. And I'm going to turn it over now to Stephanie, who's going to tell you a little bit more about that and do another exercise to kind of gather some of your thoughts. So I'll feed into that.
So yeah, thank you so much for your input. And so we're talking about the program as it exists today, but there are going to be some changes coming because we are in the middle of a water efficiency master planning effort. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I mean, we could end up with a program that looks a lot different, and it may only have outdoor programs, or some, we have a consultant working on this. So let me just talk a little bit about that. This is the process. We're starting off. We've done a little bit of community engagement just to let them know that we're doing this. We put some information in the aqueduct, and we are going to be doing a survey. One is going to be done by a national research firm to ask our customers to really dig in and find out what have they already done. We want to find out how much potential is out there still, and what actions have already been taken and what are still left to be done. So it'll look at not just like fixtures they've replaced, but other like behavioral changes and any outdoor changes in landscaping. We're also going to have a place where our customers can provide feedback that's outside of that survey. Just if they want to kind of play a role in having a say in what we're doing, we're going to welcome that. But there's a lot of initial analysis with this. So we're providing data to our consultant now, and we're looking at what we've done in the past. We're going to be revisiting the demand forecast. So we're doing a lot of data crunching now, and then we're going to, again, identify what that potential is that's still out there. And out of that will come some strategies to meet our water conservation goals. The strategies, or we call them packages in the IRP era, will be options for the conservation program moving forward. And AMI, we're intending to have as each of those packages. We'll have a final plan for this. We hope to be released at the end of 2020. But we wanted to get some feedback to kind of set us up for this effort. So if you don't mind, we're going to do a little water efficiency priorities exercise. Let's see. What we're looking for is we want your input on priorities that we should be aware of when we're developing a conservation program. So the results of this exercise will feed into the development of the strategies, as I mentioned, and we will also review these strategies once the draft or technical memo is done by the consultant for the strategies that they're proposing that we look at. We will have a board workshop to go over that, so we can really make sure they're addressing the priorities adequately. And we expect that to be sometime in the early spring of 2020. So, we are going to give everybody, all the board members, 4 dots. And we have some, we have this same...
Should we throw darts?
Dot exercise.
Should we throw darts?
Most board members are like, anything but dots. Don't make me do dots.
And so we have this list right here, which is going to be revealed over there. And so first I want to go over these priorities, because we identified these priorities. Thomas and I did a brainstorming session, and then we talked to our consultant and went through and said, are these common priorities for water districts to consider when they're looking at their conservation program direction? And so this is what we came up with. But if there's others, if there's something you don't see on here, then you have the ability to write it in and put your dot on that, or, you know, are we going to allow them to do more than 1 dot on kind of priority? I don't know.
Too bad Director Weed is not here.
Like dots either.
It's fun to see where it goes.
So I'll go through these, and if you have questions about them, then please, let me know, answer the questions, and we can also make sure we're doing, that everybody understands what we're doing and why. So, cost-effective, a targeted program to certain communities like low-income for affordability, kind of a Proposition 218 workaround. So, consistent program offerings compared to other agencies in the region. Do we want to make sure we're doing at least some of what others are doing? Being responsive to customer interest. We're going to be doing this survey that I mentioned for the Water Efficiency Master Plan, and if we get input that people really like the rain barrels or they really like something else, is that a priority for us? No new staffing. We just talked about kind of the sustainability of what's been going on now, and do we not want to add any more staffing? That could be something to address as a priority. Volume of savings, so we're just focused on how much water we're going to save, and just to make sure we can avoid the next new project, new infrastructure, new source of supply. Cost-based, so we know there's an alternative supply and it costs X amount of dollars. We want to put those dollars into conservation. Environmental stewardship, sustainability, we just want to do the right thing. From the green perspective, conservation as a means to maximize local control, maintaining a 90% level of service. We just went through a discussion about that, so you know about that, and then regulatory compliance. So just enough to meet the state water use objectives would be what that would be.
Can we modify the definition of regulatory compliance from just enough to meet to proactively meet?
Can you explain?
Well, it seems, I'm a firm believer that, that it's soft money. Regulatory compliance a lot of times is soft money. Money well spent. It's hard to quantify. And if you don't do it, it can cost you. So I don't consider it just something just to meet that. It's money well spent to ensure that, kind of like the fish ladder. We didn't have to build a fish ladder. We could have fought it. But we knew it was smarter to work with them to get a better deal. And when you view the regulatory compliance not as just enough to meet those objectives, but to hammer those objectives, make sure we're there. We don't have a problem just enough. We're doing it to ensure we're meeting.
So we did keep a category for other. I'm suggesting this may be an other, because when we see the regulatory compliance just enough, we know we're going to have to do something.
Bare minimum.
And that's the question. Is it like just do enough? What I'm hearing is perhaps it's almost like a combination of environmental stewardship. I might call it like safe bet investment or low risk investment. which would be proactive / low-risk investment. Could that maybe capture
I
that
could do it,
sentiment?
yeah.
Can we put that down as another? Wait, what did you just say?
Proactive, low-risk,
Safe bet.
safe bet. Okay.
And then is that sort of with the idea to meet regulatory compliance plus a little bit extra?
It sounds like it's a combination. You're being proactive towards regular compliance, but you're also buying goodwill, environmental stewardship, so you're encapsulating some elements of the business things.
It's pretty similar how we handle, say, an upcoming water quality regulation. We don't wait and implement just-in-time delivery. What we do is we work on it and usually implement whatever we need to proactively.
So it could even be mitigate risk. You could even call it a risk mitigation strategy. You're mitigating future risk,
Regulatory risk mitigation?
And then not just regulatory risk. We've got the regulatory, we've got the goodwill element that I heard. What do we call it? I just threw out about 4 different.
Can I take a stab at this list to get us moving here?
Before we move on, there has been a very interesting suggestion, and I'd like to say it now because that we have a member of the public here, and we have him put up dots as well.
Yes.
And the reason I say it now is so that he'll listen a little more intently.
I'm sorry. You're basically the fifth director today.
Yeah. So I just thought I'd bring it up now so you weren't surprised.
I feel very honored. Thank you very much for the temporary appointment.
Well, you have a different colored dot.
That's right. It's small.
Well, see, public dot is a very important dot.
Yes, it is. And that's
All right.
All right, let me put on my industry hat, how I would look at this from the corporate world. So I always want to be responsive to my customers first and listen intently to what the customer requirements are. So I would put responsiveness to the customer interest first. So you have an idea of what the roadmap might look like. Number 2, I would say it needs to be cost effective. 3, I think we have still a very large responsibility to target the low-income portion of our community. So that would be 3. I'm going to combine 2 of your things here with a number 4 because I see volume of savings and the cost-based bullet up above as being very closely related. It's 2 sides of the same coin. And I'll throw in a 5th, which is just, you're part of what's going on with the regional programs. And I will say that all of this leads to number 6. Use conservation as a means to maximize local control. I think if you're effective at doing all these things, then you can tell the community this is the result that all of you working together are helping us to achieve, that we maintain local control over our water supplies. We don't have to spend inordinate amounts of money, to create new supplies. You're part of helping us achieve this cost savings. So that's my analysis here.
Would you like to give us the dots now?
Where are the dots?
Yes.
The dot's after the dot.
Really only 4 dots?
So if
Oh, we really are getting dots?
So we're going to add one other.
yeah, we're gonna add the
Maybe you can sell the dot to another
oh,
director.
Bob, I said ended with Walt Waldo.
No, we brought back the dot.
So you want to be blind vote, Nate? You don't want our name on this?
No.
Okay.
And are there other rules with the dot?
Please don't load all your dots on one favorite, because I think it'll help us more to get the feedback of the range of different...
So you want 4 different ones?
Yeah.
All right.
And it's the honor code. The only way we're going to know if somebody loads up one is the member of the public.
Are you sure I can have 5
This
dollars?
is the dot.
How do I do it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to add them to the
Oh, you write it in and then put a dot there.
They put it right in your other.
Yeah, just say, you know.
Honestly, I think we would be more aggressive.
Better than regulatory compliance. I think we just do it.
It's going to be tough. But you also combine the two.
Trying to hold if anybody here wanted to do the bare minimum and walk away. I think that's what he's trying to get at.
Yeah. No, I like that. I think it's a good point. I mean, we find a lot of goodwill with probably a whole bunch of environmental.
Sorry.
Yeah, it was my baby. Yeah, we decided to adopt to
You can't have it. I know, there's 2 more I want. That is so unfair.
I eliminated the one.
No, the other 2 out there.
No, you guys are
This one's not. But people hate eliminating it.
But look how lined up.
I'm recording it.
Can we vote twice on this? No.
It's the honor code.
No, I just heard this.
This exercise actually shows a lot about both the board and staff.
Well, we got to put you to work.
Besides that, it was actually interesting to watch your reaction.
Mine?
All of you. You folks are trying to figure out the problem. You do understand how he's sitting here and he's looking at all those dots and he starts figuring out all the issues that's going to come with all these dots and he's trying to formulate the question.
Well,
Or Laura, and it's actually kind of interesting to see how you guys react to the way we sit about it. I'm just being interesting.
you stepped into something we were hoping nobody would step into.
Which is?
How do you define house safety? We're going to have to hit this and get a work photo resolution.
Is that your own person?
Oh, wow.
And we stop for more. You guys, okay.
Got one more jobs than I think I was right about combining two kids.
It would be kind of weird if we started seeing yellow ones. Have you ever done this kind of exercise? It's all way to try to narrow down.
John would be like, right now,
But truthfully,
of course.
there's a bunch of them that great.
I mean, that would have been
Yeah.
benefit, but it's the ratio.
Yeah, and it's not.
The agency is trying to
Which one? Reminder should stop.
Great. We're back up. We're back up. No.
That's 30%. If you guys are being,
Yeah. It's okay.
Any discussion we have.
That's fine. I just wanted,
Part of the
okay.
meeting.
I
We're-
wasn't sure.
Ready to...
We're back up to another bell.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll see what they want to do.
Yeah. It is a chart.
It is, and then we go to section we actually converge.
They're very future regs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Shall we have a good one? Good emphasis on that.
I don't know, that green dot seems to like really be like a swing button.
You know, one thing I see here, which I think is a reflection of the board, is that we are really a business-driven,
Smart decision-making.
right, and so you see cost-effective and cost-based as being two leading things up there, and I think it comes from our general philosophy that we want to be a business-driven type district.
So, this is very interesting. You guys stepped right into something that we anticipated, which is on cost-effective. And there's two classic ways to define cost-effective. When we do historically we've done cost-effectiveness exemptions when we were beholden to the best management practices with the California Council. And that defined the avoided cost of production. What does it cost right now, weighted average, to produce 1 unit of water? And Devin, was it $6.50 last year?
Yeah.
So it's about $650 an acre foot. That's our overall, all-in, what does it cost to produce our average unit of water, all our supplies, all our facilities. That's the cost-effectiveness exemption, which is a historic reference. In water supply master planning, we typically talk about the marginal cost, the next unit of water. We have our supplies. If demand goes up and we have to develop a new supply, what's the unit cost of that water? And combining 7, which was a cost-based, how much conservation could be achieved for the cost of an alternative supply, with 1, I'm just going to posit that the board is in the same philosophy here, which is cost-effectiveness should be up to the marginal cost, which is currently about $2,200 an acre foot. So is that a safe conclusion that we would consider, and this is actually our recommendation, we took the slide down, that we should consider everything up to the marginal cost of the next unit of supply, which is currently about $2,200, as arguably a cost-effective conservation investment?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks, you did our work for us.
Would anybody like to channel their internal director lead and vote that way?
No, but to internally channel director lead, we could go back a couple slides where you said that AMI will be a part of each package. I would say when you're developing the package, because when we talk about AMI, we did honestly say there are off-ramps that's built into the project. So when you are thinking about the package, you want to consider the possibility or probability AMI will not happen. I am pretty sure Director Wee, my inner Director Wee, is saying you want to consider that scenario.
Now, not to be counter to Director Lee.
The person channeling Director Wee.
I also was sitting here thinking at one point that AMI may start to offer us a very interesting tool with conservation. And where, I used the term earlier, a while back, it's just on the side, soft money. We might be able to get more ideas of how soft that money really is if we have data coming in that strongly, that quickly. Some of that we might be able to actually analyze and get some real data. We've always said, well, and it's been a fact, I mean, obviously, we see the data, 27%. We saw what the revenue hit was. But you might be able to drive it in closer if you have AMI. Just thinking out loud.
And I'll just note that staff did not add an item to the list regarding the rate structure's ability to drive conservation.
That would have been 13 there. So.
And none of you added it either.
I was not channeling certain someone.
Nor did we put in tiered rates, which are not off the table.
All right, so.
Okay, any other reflections? I think everybody kind of got a chance to see where the dots are at, so I don't want to dwell on that unless anybody wants to make a review. We're good with that?
Was it?
Okay, then we just did want to take just a minute to kind of wrap up. We're at the end, and so we wanted to wrap up on just some of our conclusions that we've come to, and we didn't put specifics on here because we weren't sure where the board might land on some of these things, but just to review some of the planning assumptions, it sounded like we had some pretty good positive concurrence on that. Nobody was objecting to using EchoSed, and we have sort of our, I know we have some concern expressed about the AMI 5% reduction assumptions. And then we did talk a little bit about the legislation impacting our planning assumptions as well. So that's kind of that quick topic. And then I was pulling out each one as we went here. Our level of service, it sounded like we had good agreement that we should go ahead and plan on both the 90 and the 80% level of service, and think about changing that for our 2025 water supply master plan process, and also consider our 2014 0% allocation anomaly for now, pending further information. Is there anything I've missed on those two topics that we wanted to clear up? Okay. And then on water conservation, this is great feedback for us. And were there slides in here? Just have those.
No.
Okay.
But one takeaway is we said conservation, cost-effective up to the marginal cost of the next unit of new supply.
Okay, so that is
That's very helpful.
great. So that, along with the feedback on the priorities and sort of the level of effort that we're spending now, that will be very helpful in feeding into our water efficiency master plan process that you'll be hearing more about. And then future policy considerations, we have those 3 different new criteria that we are thinking about: our policy objectives, climate readiness, resiliency, and enhanced flexibility. So it sounded pretty positive on that. So we'll continue to pursue looking at that when we update our modeling and technical work. So with that, next steps, we're going to wrap up today, but we're coming back in October, and that's going to be a real meaty discussion. It was good to hear what everybody had to say today, because I think that'll really help us focus our work for October. We'll be reevaluating some of the other IRP objectives, criteria, and elements, so we should get into some other fun details. And then we're looking at potentially a couple of different spring and summer workshops next year, kind of see how October goes and how much we're able to cover. But we'll be reviewing modeling results, previewing our 2020 Urban Water Management Plan, and then as Stephanie mentioned, the Water Efficiency Master Plan, we'll definitely be doing some updates and providing some feedback to you guys on the different packages that we will be putting together based on the input today. So, yeah, questions?
Laura, when is the state deadline for submitting the urban water management plan?
And I think it's the 2020 Urban Water Management Plan, but it's not due till 2021, is that right?
July 1st, 2020, or July 30th, midnight, 2021. June 30th.
June 30th, 2021.
Yeah, and that's the second time extension due to the SB 7 legislation, which required the 6-month extension both in 15 and 20. After that, it'll go back to the ordinary years.
Do we have to submit a preliminary version of the plan at some point? Just a final?
Yeah, we have, and I'm stretching, we have some obligations to do public hearings on the development of the plan. I forget exactly what those are. It's just public noticing process to invite people to come in.
So the technical work takes quite a while, which is why we're going to be starting now, even though it's a couple years away for the deadline. other
Is
questions?
the urban water management plan is updated, what, every 5 years for the state, right? Is the water efficiency master plan, is that something that came down as a state requirement, or is this something we're doing just for ourselves internally?
This is something we're doing ourselves. We don't have to. I know it's something that Tom and Sethy have expressed that we've been wanting to do for a long time.
Well, it's key to the IRP, the Water Supply Master Plan update. Right? Do we have the calendar?
You know, we took out the calendar of the timeline. In the strategic plan, you may remember we had a bunch of different initiatives that we're working on over the next few years. And the Water Efficiency Master Plan was one that we're starting and then finishing that and then moving into the IRP process as part of our 5-year plan.
Okay, and just to clarify in my own mind, I lose track of these things. The IRP, is that state required? Or
No.
no? So it's our own
The
internal...
UWMP is, yeah.
It's our long-range master plan for everything water supply, and a little more.
And other agencies are calling them water supply master plans.
Standard term.
And which feeds into the others? Is it the IRP goes into the urban water management plan, or is it the other way around?
Do you mind?
Go for it.
The analyses we do for the urban water management plan are guided by everything that's in the IRP. And the IRP is also the documentation and sort of commitment. We'll have to do programmatic CEQA. It's a commitment if there's new future supplies available and if we're going to depend on those supplies. When we document that in the urban water management plan, it provides the support for that to some degree. But for the most part, it just gives us guidance on how to prepare and optimize our system to put into the urban water management plan. And I always refer to that, the UWMP, as a sort of our contract with our customers. It's just the documentation of our supplies, how we operate, and shows what our reliability expectations are so that when people think, hey, are you guys counting for new development and whatnot, we can show them, yes, we are, and here's the level of reliability we anticipate giving you and new customers at these different points in time in the future. We're obligated to look 20 years out and provide that reliability to the public.
Thank you.
For the comments, questions, I believe we can close this workshop, but we have general manager's reports now. We're closing the workshop portion of the report. We got general manager's reports, item number 6.
Very quickly, Mr. Wunderlich, Manager of Finance, has a quick announcement regarding audit questions.
Yes. Our new auditor has asked that all board members fill out a brief questionnaire. Don't do it tonight. I'm going to hand this out to you. Take it home with you. It comes with an addressed and stamped envelope, so you will return it directly to the auditor. You should not come back to staff to talk about this. Okay? It's just a few questions about conflict of interest and if you're aware of any fraud. All right, so usually they have in-person interviews with certain board members, and they've actually done that already with Director Sethy and Director Weed as the Finance Committee members. But because it's their first time with us, I think they wanted to have all board members fill out this brief questionnaire. And so I will hand this out. No, not an essay test.
And that concludes.
Okay, director comments, agenda item requests.
No?
Not for me either.
Not from me either. Well, I believe that brings us to number 8. Item number 8 is adjournment.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
7:31?